started. And it's B.T. Henry, says he can't stop the mop. Well, thank you, B.T. Henry. Wow, what a day. Folks, so glad to be with you. Welcome, 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 welcome. Welcome, 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 welcome. It should be a fun little conversation this evening. It is Thursday. It is 7 p.m. New York City time, and I am ready to talk with all of you, our beloved community. So welcome, 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 welcome. Glad you're here. Be sure to hit the like button. Be sure to hit the subscribe button. Be sure to hit the notifications bell. And the way we do things here, let's not forget, is that I give my opening remarks. Then we do our roll call, where I call you out as I see you. And then from there, I answer your super chats, and then the show is over. So that's how it works. The super chats are the second half of the show. The opening remarks are the first half. Our little intermission is me calling out everyone as I see them, names and locations, so we remember who everyone is, and it's really, really fun. Now, before I start my opening remarks, I must inform you all of a vitally important event that just happened. I got a new tie. So that's important, right? Let's all, put that, remember how important that is in your daily life, that I have bought a new tie. It is probably a life-changing event. I'll give you time to adjust and deal with that. I'm just kidding. No, I don't know. It's been a good time, really. I mean, it's been a bad time. I mean, we see what's happening in the Middle East. A lot of us are just outraged by the daily horrific events that we're hearing about. A lot of us are angry about the economic crisis. A lot is going on, so I will do my best to just give you some distraction tonight and put forward our socialist, anti-imperialist message, try to give analysis that is useful. So be sure to hit the like button, be sure to hit the subscribe button, be sure to hit the notifications bell, post this on Reddit, post this on Twitter, tweet it out, Facebook it, bring all your friends. This will be a great conversation, but the bigger, the better. Send me a super chat if you want an answer. If there's something that's on your mind you'd like me to address, send me a super chat. I will be writing them down and answering them in the second half of our show. That's how I do it with super chats. So there you go, folks. All right, let's start my opening remarks. Now, this isn't a big speech tonight by any means, but I actually had the idea that tonight I would discuss with you the lyrics to one of my favorite songs and how it points to truths about imperialism. I'm not going to sing it for you because I am not a vocalist. I am not a musical. I do like to break into song occasionally, but I'm not a professional singer, so I will not put you through me singing it. One of my favorite songs, which synthetic left did most damage. One of my favorite songs, it's not a leftist song, not a Marxist song at all, and I would say I probably vehemently disagree with the politics of the song, but it points to a huge amount of truth about imperialism from the time it was written in the 1800s right up to today. And that song is Over the Hills and Far Away. And it is not the Led Zeppelin song of that name. It is the British Army marching song, non-Hamas Freedom Palestine Fighters. It is the British Army marching song, Over the Hills and Far Away. So I'm just going to, I don't know if people have heard it, but the lyrics to this popular British Army marching song actually contain a huge amount of political and psychological and historical insight into imperialism, labor aristocracy, settler colonialism, surplus value, capitalism, etc. And I don't know if people have heard this song. It has nothing to do with the Led Zeppelin song, just the same title, completely different song, but here's 40 shillings on the drum for those who volunteer to come to list and fight the foe today, over the hills and far away, over the hills and o'er the main, to Flanders, Portugal, and Spain. The Queen commands and we obey, over the hills and far away. We all shall lead more happy lives by getting rid of brats and wives. that scold and brawl both night and day, over the hills and far away, over the hills and o'er the main, to Flanders, Portugal, and Spain. The Queen commands, and we obey, over the hills and far away. Right? Very famous British Army marching song. There was a version of it for children. I think it was a children's kind of nursery rhyme, and they turned it into a British Army marching song. Housing bubble. Bubble. New. A real counter-hegemonic culture. Real counter-hegemonic culture. All right. When duty calls me, I must go to stand and face another foe. But part of me will always stray over the hills and far away, over the hills and o'er the main, to Flanders, Portugal, and Spain. The Queen commands, and we obey, over the hills and far away. If I should fall to rise no more, as many comrades did before, then ask the fifes and drums to play over the hills and far away, over the hills and o'er the main, to Flanders, Portugal, and Spain. The Queen commands, and we obey, over the hills and far away. Then fall in, lads, behind the drum, with colors blazing like the sun, along the road to come what may, over the hills and far away. Apprentice Tom may now refuse to wipe his scoundrel master's shoes, for now he's free to sing and play, over the hills and far away. Over the hills and o'er the main, to Flanders, Portugal, and Spain. The Queen commands, and we obey, over the hills and far away. Very famous British Army marching song, and there's different versions of it. I actually combined a number of... Hey, alrighty, we're back. And yes, a lot of different versions of this British Army marching song. I combined different versions of it because there are many different versions. But it really has a lot to say about imperialism. So, for the first line, here's 40 shillings on the drum for those who volunteer to come to list and fight the foe today, over the hills and far away. That's actually a reference to what was called press ganging. Now, when British imperialism was emerging, the British imperialists argued, and it was widely understood. In fact, the first book of geopolitics was published by a British political theorist. I forget his name, but he published a book basically arguing the way for British capitalism to dominate the world was through control of the trade routes. And that would mean that they had to build the world's largest navy, right? As Britain is becoming an imperialist country, right? As it's going from being a capitalist country, feudalism is overturned, capitalism is emerging. As British capitalism moves to its stage of imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, part of that is the dominance of the financial sector over the industrial sector, right? Industries become, just like basically subordinated by banks. Lenin, in his book Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, writes extensively about how imperialism, in the 1880s, 1890s, as imperialism became the new stage of capitalism, bankers became the dominant form, and industrial capitalists were subordinated. And Britain largely dominated the global economy by control of the textile industry. When the British went to India, famously, right? India had been weaving cloth for thousands of years, but they burned all the looms of India and forced them to import their cloth from Britain. And that, Britain, by controlling the trade routes, which at that point meant controlling the ocean, they could dominate the global economy. It was a lot like the Roman Empire, right? By controlling the trade routes. In the Roman Empire, they said all roads lead to Rome. You couldn't build a road from one part of the empire to another. All the roads had to go through them. Palestinian left. All the roads had to go through them. By doing that, they could make themselves the center of the global economy, right? That's the nature of imperialism. It's, basically dominating the trade routes. And that's what the British Empire did. And in order to do that, they had to build the world's largest navy, And they wrote about this, that the secret to dominating the world is control of the world's trade routes. And what people now call Atlanticism is the theory that the world economy can be controlled by those who control the trade routes, kind of becoming the middleman in global trade, having the high seas dominated by one country, maritime dominance. That is the secret to controlling the world. And the British Empire largely believed that the way to control the world was having the world's largest navy. And in order to do that, they constantly had to be, forcing huge chunks of their population to become sailors and to become, naval members of the Navy. And so there was a huge amount of what they called impressing or press ganging, where they were conscripting people to become Navy soldiers. But they didn't call it conscription because you weren't becoming an army, an infantryman or a member of the other branches of the military, because you were joining the Navy. It had a different name. It was referred to as impressing or press ganging. And so that opening line in the song, 40 shillings on the drum for those who volunteer to come, referred to the fact that basically when you were being press ganged, the British Navy would approach you, and they would say, look, you've got a choice. Now you can volunteer, and if you volunteer, we give you 2 months' salary up front, right? That's 40 shillings on the drum. And you get treated better. But if we end up having to force you against your will, you get only a king's shilling, 1 shilling, and you get treated badly. And so, it was basically, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. And if you were press ganged into the British Navy, and if you refused to be press ganged, the penalty was death. They had hangings. They hung people. And often when there was a shortage of sailors, they would just go and round up all the homeless people. And, for vagrancy, right? Vagrants. If you were homeless, basically, in Britain, which there was a lot of homelessness during the Industrial Revolution, right? The boom-bust cycle was, much, all the stabilization mechanisms we had to try and stabilize the capitalist system hadn't been developed yet. There was no Federal Reserve. There was none of that. Right, so there was a panic or an economic crash every few years, and so there'd be lots of homeless people, and the British Navy would just go out and grab homeless people, and you want to join the military, or you want to join the Navy, or you want to get hung, and there's many stories of sailors, being, that they would, there'd be people in a bar and they'd be drinking, and a Navy officer would come in and drop a king's shilling into their drink, and they would drink, and at the bottom of their cup would be the king's shilling, meaning that they had been forcibly recruited. They'd been press ganged. So yeah, that 40 shillings on the drum for those who volunteer to come. Ad libs, neoliberalism. That's what that was referring to. Hezbollah. That's what that was referring to. It was referring to the practice of press ganging. And if you could be persuaded to volunteer to go into the army, you got better treatment. Now, the next part I wanted to refer to is this line about apprentice Tom may now refuse to wipe his scoundrel master's shoes, for now he's free to sing and play over the hills and far away. Well, this refers to apprenticeship, right? And you know about this, that if you learn a trade, and they still have apprenticeships, but if you learn a trade like being a pipe fitter or a carpenter or, like if you become a skilled craftsman, you go through a period of apprenticeship where you're being taught how to take on the trade, like, back in the day, a blacksmith, a plumber, you go through a period where you're an apprentice, meaning that somebody who is in the skilled trade is like teaching it to you, right? And when you're an apprentice, historically apprentices were, they were almost servants. Not almost. I mean, they were basically, servants or unpaid kind of slaves of the person, giving them their apprenticeship. And there were a lot of degrading rituals that went on. The master of the apprentice would beat the apprentice. He'd be forced to, again, this refers to being forced to clean the shoes. And that these kind of rituals create resentment, right? As you can imagine, right? If you're basically being forced to wipe someone's shoes or being whipped or flogged by somebody, and you have to go through this initiation of 4 or 5 years of being degraded and humiliated before you can ultimately go into your job, it creates a level of resentment. And that kind of resentment, these kind of humiliating rituals, has a lot to do with imperialism. And you wouldn't think that, but it absolutely does. That the kind of, and especially working class people in Britain and, in the Western countries were humiliated on a daily basis. The constant, obedience and bowing before those who had some authority over them. They talk about in Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific by Friedrich Engels. He talks about how the factory owners in France had a practice of what they called prima nocta, or the first night. And Friedrich Engels talks about this, right? During the Middle Ages, it was in some areas, it was a feudal practice that in order to humiliate and degrade the peasantry, the local noble, the duke or the earl or the local noble would humiliate peasant men by having sexual rights to their wives on the first night they were married. The noble would humiliate the peasants by blessing the marriage, by basically raping the wife of the peasant on the first night of their marriage. And this went on throughout Europe. And Friedrich Engels, in his book Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific, talks about how after the overthrow of feudalism in France, when capitalism was emerging, the factory owners would start doing this to their employees, to humiliate their employees. They would say, well, part of your contract to work here is that I have the right to have sex with your wife on the first night of your wedding, of your marriage. And Friedrich Engels talks about how this was going on. And again, this is humiliation. And, it was going on, and it was part of, and this was a hangover from feudalism, right? That the peasantry was constantly subjected to this kind of humiliation and degradation, and the craziest thing is, this was rape of women, but it wasn't even intended to target the women. It was mainly aimed at humiliating their husbands. No one even thought about the women who were being raped in the process. It was all just about, the man is being degraded because his woman is being raped by another man. It's really a horrific practice, and it went on throughout Europe. And it's funny because it didn't go on in Britain, from what I understand. It went on in France. It went on in some other places. In the Hollywood movie Braveheart, if you've ever seen it, they portray it as going on in Scotland. That did not happen. That is not historically accurate. That's something that Mel Gibson or whoever wrote the screenplay made up for the movie Braveheart. It's in the movie Braveheart, but they didn't actually do it in Scotland. But it was in France, and Friedrich Engels talks about how the factory owners, after the French Revolution, were doing this in their factories. And that there were all kinds of routine humiliations that working class people had to endure. And that resentment was a big part of working class life, whether it was the apprenticeships, whether it was, these kind of degrading rituals. There was this constant effort to make people feel less than others, right? And this rigid enforcement of hierarchy. And that imperialism, in a way, hijacked that resentment in order to build the empire. And you can find that in the work of Rudyard Kipling. I don't know if folks know Rudyard Kipling. He was the British poet. He wrote the white supremacist poem, The White Man's Burden, right? Take up the white man's burden. Bring forth the breast ye breed, right? And it was all about imperialism. And one of the poems of Rudyard Kipling refers to the fact that that soldiers, people that were members of the British military, redcoats, were often banned from restaurants, that high-class restaurants in Britain wouldn't serve you if you were wearing a uniform. Even though these people were going out and fighting for the empire, because they wore a uniform, they were considered to be vulgar working-class people. And so redcoats were denied the right to eat in restaurants simply because they were wearing a military uniform. It's kind of the opposite. Nowadays, there's kind of this feeling that if someone's wearing a uniform, you should applaud them and thank them. But in the British Empire, there was this degradation. And one of Rudyard Kipling's poems, he writes this way. He says, "Went into a public house to get a pint of beer. The publican and he says, we serve no redcoats here. The girl behind the bar, they laughed and giggled fit to die. And I outs in the street again. To myself, I says, oh, Tommy this and Tommy that and Tommy go away. But it's thank you, Mr. Atkins, when the band begins to play. The band begins to play, my boys, the band begins to play. And thank you, Mr. Atkins, when the band begins to play." And the poem goes on, and it says, "Don't mess around the cookroom slops, but prove it to your face. The widow's uniform is not the soldier man's disgrace. For it's Tommy this and Tommy that, and chuck him out, the brute. But it's savior of the country when the guns begin to shoot. And it's Tommy this and Tommy that, and anything you please. And Tommy ain't a bloomin' fool, you bet that Tommy sees." And it was, again, working class people, because they were not part of the elite, were constantly subject to humiliations, right? Somebody might be wearing the uniform of the British military, and they'd try to go into a bar to get a drink, and they'd be kicked out, right? And this kind of degradation. But one of the themes you find in Rudyard Kipling's work, which refers to why in the opening of this British song, this British military song, they're saying, "Apprentice Tom may now refuse to wipe his scoundrel master's shoes, for now he's free." Is that the feeling of a lot of the pro-imperialist literature from Rudyard Kipling and others was that the way for the working class of the imperialist homelands to redeem themselves was by going to the developing world to be overseers and bosses. Is that, okay, fine, in the homeland, the working class, you're being worked to death in textile factories, you're not allowed to eat in the same restaurants as the rich, you're being forced to wipe people's shoes, you're being beaten by your apprentice, your apprenticeship master, and, but the idea was that imperialism and colonialism was a way that the angry, humiliated, degraded working class could gain some dignity. Right? And it's a horrendous aspect of the formative years of imperialism was that the promise to the working class was, well, you don't have to be kicked around anymore. We'll send you to Africa. We'll send you to India. We'll send you to Asia. And we'll let you kick around some black and brown people in the developing world, and you can feel like a man for once. Right? I mean, it's horrendous, but that was how the British Empire operated. There's a very famous, it's quoted by Lenin in the book Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, that Cecil Rhodes, who was the big colonizer of Africa, Zimbabwe, before it gained its freedom, was known as Rhodesia after Cecil Rhodes, that Cecil Rhodes, he's quoted by Lenin as he was walking through a working class quarter, and he listened to speeches of the unemployed, right? And there was protests by hungry unemployed people. And he listened to their wild speeches, and it was just a cry for bread, bread, bread. And this forced Cecil Rhodes to ponder the importance of imperialism, that imperialism is a bread and butter issue. To avoid a civil war, to avoid an uprising of the unemployed, we must become imperialists of the hungry, unemployed people that are dwelling in Britain's urban centers. Instead of having them rise up in revolt, send them to Africa, send them to Asia, send them to Latin America to be bosses and overseers and soldiers and settlers to kick around the developing world, and we can prevent a civil war. Cecil Rhodes said himself, if we want to prevent a civil war, or like a working class revolution, we must become imperialists. This is part of this mindset. And actually, Rudyard Kipling, it's really wild. When I was a kid, one of the stories they would read us in school was a Rudyard Kipling short story. And it was called How the Elephant Got His Trunk. It's a demented fairy tale. It is a demented fairy tale. And it's in, I think Rudyard Kipling had a collection of children's stories he called Just So Stories. It's demented. It's a demented fairy tale. Basically, the story goes like this. There's the little baby elephant, and the baby elephant's relatives, its mother and father, its uncle the giraffe, its tiger cousin or whatever, are always humiliating him and spanking him, right? And he's just enduring this humiliation. And one of the main reasons that they beat this baby elephant is because the baby elephant is asking too many questions. Too many questions, right? It's asking too many questions. It has insatiable curiosity. And because it has insatiable curiosity, this baby elephant is constantly being beaten. And one of the questions this baby elephant asks, to the obnoxious annoyance of his relatives, the baby elephant is asking, "What does the alligator eat for dinner?" And of course, goes around to its parents. The parents don't answer the question; they just beat him. The giraffe doesn't answer the question, just beats him. The lion, the tiger, they just beat him. They don't answer his question. So the baby elephant goes down to the river, where the crocodile is, wanting to find out what the crocodile eats for dinner. The crocodile then latches onto the baby elephant's nose. They have this little tug of war, right? This tug of war goes on. And after that, the baby elephant's nose becomes long. The elephant gets its trunk, and then it goes back to its parents. And every time the parents try to beat him, why, he has this big trunk, and he beats them back, right? It's demented. I mean, this is like one of the most disgusting, you want to talk about, this is not the kind of story one should read to children, okay? It's not exactly promoting healthy family relations. It's a pretty demented fairy tale from Rudyard Kipling. But it's meant to be an analogy for the British working class. The idea is the British working class is getting kicked around at home, it's being kicked around at school, it's being kicked around in the workplace, it's being kicked around, etc. But by going to the developing world, by becoming a colonizer, it can gain some dignity. Right? It can gain some dignity in the world by becoming a colonizer. That's the idea. Is that it can gain some dignity by becoming a colonizer. And it was about weaponizing the resentment that working class people had against the constant degradation that they faced. And that was a huge part of the mindset of the British Empire and how they built their empire, right? And if you look at the atrocities committed by British settlers in Africa, where they would gun down whole villages, with these, they had the early machine guns, and you hear these stories of British settlers would just gun down entire villages with these early machine guns. You read about what they did in England, or they did in India, the massacres that went on, and just the horrendous ways, like in Kenya and places like that, they would, these British settlers would treat the people they were colonizing. A lot of times these British settlers, they were poor people, right? They were poor people from Britain who'd been degraded and kicked around their entire lives. And so they went to the developing world, and in the hopes of gaining their dignity and feeling like they had accomplished something, they would dole out this horrendous, vicious, sadistic treatment upon the people they were colonizing. This was a reality of the British Empire, and this is how imperialism generally works. And I think up until today, this is a reality. Look, a lot of the military in the United States are very impoverished working class people. I've had many friends in the military that say, if you go into the military, it's country music and rap music. It's poor white people and poor black people, right? It's country music for the poor whites, and it's rap music for the poor black people, right? And it's low-income people that go into the military who have been kicked around their whole lives, have been degraded, have seen their communities devastated, by drugs, have, had police brutality and the police state, pointing guns at them and threatening them, have been treated and degraded, their whole lives, and been demonized, whether it's demonized as gang members or demonized as white trash or whatever. It's working class people who've been demonized their whole life. And then the U.S. military sends them to Iraq or to Afghanistan, and they're there. And every so often we see the horrendous things that the U.S. military will do in the country it's occupying, right? In Afghanistan, there was a group of soldiers who were urinating on the corpses of people that were killed, of civilians who were killed. These civilians were killed, and these soldiers were like videoing themselves peeing on the dead bodies. That's disgusting, right? You can look at Abu Ghraib, right, and what went on in Abu Ghraib, right, and and what went on there, and how they were torturing people, and they had this demented, mistreatment of prisoners that was exposed, during the Bush years. You can talk about what was done. What's been done, the Haditha massacre, I believe, that was horrendous. And this kind of thing goes on. And again, this is people who've been degraded their whole lives. They've been humiliated. They've seen their communities economically destroyed. They get treated, treated as unwanted and as treated as practically criminal in their daily lives. They're subject to abuse and mistreatment and such. And so then they're shipped overseas, and the idea is they can gain their dignity by dishing out that treatment on other people. And one particularly gross aspect of it is, I don't know if folks will remember that during the Bush years, there was the Jessica Lynch situation, and there was this whole push for women to join the military, right? And it was like joining the U.S. military was feminist, right? This woman named Jessica Lynch, who was very good looking, I think she was from Wilmington, West Virginia. She was very good looking, and she was fighting in Iraq, and she got captured by the Iraqis, and then, she was liberated, and they made up this whole story about how she had been raped by the Iraqis troops and all this, and it wasn't true, right? She'd been injured, her military vehicle ran off the road into a ditch. The Iraqis took her to the hospital and were treating her wounds. She wasn't tortured, she wasn't raped, she wasn't any of those things, and they just, they were treating her wounds. And then the U.S. Army came in with a SWAT team and liberated her from the doctors who were treating her wounds, and that was it. But they made this whole made-for-TV movie, they made all this propaganda, and it was all about how, like, women who have been degraded in the United States, who have been, subject to sexual assault and have been mistreated by their boyfriends and their husbands and their fathers, and, are subject to catcalling and sexual harassment and, an increasingly pornographic culture that views women as objects, that women can gain dignity by joining the U.S. military. Right? That was the idea, right? That women could gain dignity by joining the U.S. military and going to Iraq and beating down and destroying, an Arab country. And that was very much pushed, and it's still pushed. And if you look at some of the torture at Abu Ghraib, it was a lot of times it was female U.S. military people who were torturing these Iraqis, right? And, the idea was that, these are Muslims, and so they're sexist, right? They mistreat women because, this anti-Islamic kind of feeling. And there's instances where you look at, I don't want to get into too many specifics, but you look at some of the ways these women were degrading the Iraqi men. You look at some of the ways they were degrading them, and it was sexual torture. I mean, it was like they were forcing the men to pretend they were gay and do, pretend gay sex acts. They were doing some other stuff I don't want to get into details about, but a lot of times it was women soldiers who were torturing these Iraqi men, and they were engaging in like sexual degradation. And again, these are women that had been sexually harassed their whole lives. The rate of sexual assault in the U.S. military, among women in the U.S. military, is very, very high. Women in the U.S. military are sexually assaulted very often. I mean, look at the details about that. So these women are being sexually harassed and sexually assaulted in the U.S. military. And then, they probably joined the military on the notion that that was going to be their place, where they were going to be dignity, they were going to be Jessica Lynch, it was girl power. So they joined the U.S. military, they're being sexually assaulted and sexually harassed in the military, and then they get their hands on an Iraqi prisoner, and they think, okay, I got my hands on an Iraqi prisoner. Well, now I can make him pay. I can make him feel like the bitch, I mean, it's sick. It's sick, but this is how imperialist armies tend to work. They tend to hijack the resentment of working class people, hijack the resentment and the anger that working class people have, and utilize it as a vehicle for beating down people in the developing world. And it's very, very, very sad, and it's very, very tragic. But it serves a purpose. It serves a purpose because we know, as Cecil Rhodes said, if If you want to prevent a civil war, you must become imperialists. And what Cecil Rhodes realized was these hungry, unemployed people in Britain who were angry about their mistreatment and angry about the fact they didn't have jobs, they were going to rise up in revolt. And they had a boiling, brewing anger. So it was better to push that resentment and push them out into the developing world, send them around the world to be colonizers, send them around the world to take out their rage on black and brown people in the developing world, than to stay in the homeland and rise up in revolt. So there you go. That's what this song is getting at. The whole line about Apprentice Tom may now refuse to wipe his scoundrel master's shoes. That's what it's about. That's what it's about. Now, there's a couple other lines in it that I thought are amusing. There's one line: "We all shall lead more happy lives by getting rid of brats and wives that scold and brawl both night and day over the hills and far away." Well, that's interesting. Now, this probably isn't referring to that. That's probably just, military men, like, oh, I don't, no women here, right? All men, it's not directly referring to it. But the idea of decreasing the birth rate was an obsession among the British ruling elite. In the 1880s, 1890s, up into the 1900s, the Malthusian thinking, the neo-Malthusians, that was a big, big obsession. This idea that we need to decrease the birth rate. Poor people, working class people are having too many children, and that's the cause of the problem, right? That is it goes back to 1798 when Robert Malthus, who was a British economist, he was basically assigned to write a book explaining the French Revolution. He said, well, the French Revolution wasn't caused by, feudalism being an outmoded system. It was caused by the fact the French poor people, the French peasants, were having too many babies. And if you read Malthus' writings, he calls for the conditions facing low-income people to get worse. He calls for disease, he calls for wars to reduce the population. And this was the feeling among the British capitalist classes. There are just too many people in the world. And especially as capitalism was producing a bigger and bigger reserve army of unemployed, as that was happening, they really started thinking this. And this is reflected in all kinds of literature. For example, I don't know if folks are familiar with A Christmas Carol. A Christmas Carol. All right, writing it down. Slow voice using. Right? A Christmas Carol. It's by Charles Dickens. And there's a famous line in A Christmas Carol when, some family is getting thrown out of their home and, he says, oh, why don't they go live in the poorhouse? And the person says, oh, some of them would rather die, Mr. Scrooge. And Mr. Scrooge says, well, if they would rather die, then they better do it and reduce the surplus population. Right? Well, that's Scrooge in A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens is a Malthusian, and he's saying that it's better to let poor people die than to provide them services because it will reduce the surplus population. This was the British imperialist attitude. Now, the Rockefeller family in the United States, that's like, the Rockefellers, the rich oil dynasty, right? They're John D. Rockefeller founded Standard Oil. Today, we have ExxonMobil, which is the descendant of Standard Oil. John D. Rockefeller is probably the richest American in all of history. If you adjust for inflation, how much money he had, no American ever had anything close to what he had. His sons, I believe, he himself and his children were very much Malthusians. Margaret Sanger. Margaret Sanger was a socialist. She was a member of the Socialist Party in New York City. She was a sponsor financially of the IWW. She gave money to the Wobblies, but she was all about free love. And she went into exile in Britain. And then when the Bolshevik Revolution, when the Russian Revolution happened, the Russian Revolution of 1917 happened, the Soviet Union didn't turn out to be the big free love society that she wanted it to be. It wasn't a free love sex paradise, the Soviet Union. In fact, the Soviet Union became quite socially conservative, right? They glorified the Soviet family, etc. And because the Soviet Union wasn't the free love, free sex paradise she wanted, she turned against Marxism. right? And Margaret Sanger abandoned Marxism for Malthusianism. And the Rockefeller family sponsored Margaret Sanger to open up birth control clinics in the United States, to fight hard to overturn the laws against birth control in the United States. And Margaret Sanger started hanging out with the Ku Klux Klan, and she started hanging out with eugenicists and white supremacists. And when the Great Depression happened, right? So the Great Depression, right, happened. All the communists and socialists are going out and organizing and demanding that they provide unemployment insurance and relief to the people that are suffering. Margaret Sanger says the opposite. She says the Great Depression was caused by just too many people in the world, so we should let all the poor people die. That's what she's saying. We should let all the poor people die. So she has the exact opposite message of the communists in the 1930s. She went from Marxism to Malthusianism. And the reason she did it was, at the end of the day, she didn't care about class struggle. She didn't care about economics. She didn't care about the working class. She just wanted to have sex. It was about sex, right? She traded socialism for sex. That's what Margaret Sanger did. And because she traded socialism for sex, because she wasn't really in it for working class struggle and socialism and liberation, she was in it because she was into sex. She was a sex addict. Because of that, Margaret Sanger became a Malthusian. And Hillary Clinton loves Margaret Sanger. And, she's just idealized by liberals because she was so, big into promoting contraception and abortion, and, Planned Parenthood is the descendant of the birth control league that was started by Margaret Sanger. She's downright awful. In one of her letters, she talks about the need to, cultivate black ministers to promote birth control and how they shouldn't let them know that our goal is to exterminate black people. She was basically calling for the extermination of black people. She went from Marxism to Malthusianism, right? And that Malthusian thinking was a huge part of British imperialism. This idea that you shouldn't have children, that the poor people breed too much, and that's the problem. And what's particularly wild about that is that there have been many attempts to push Malthusianism into the Marxist movement. One of the biggest examples is Sorelianism. George Sorel, right? The leader of French syndicalism. He was a revisionist Marxist in France who became like the ideological father of syndicalism. They didn't call it anarcho-syndicalism back then, and it wasn't exactly anarcho what he was pushing. The syndicalist George Sorel, he promoted this notion of the birth strike. The birth strike. And his anarchist groups were going all over Europe, his syndicalist groups, I should say, all over Europe, telling working class people they shouldn't have children because it'll drive the wages down, and they should have a birth strike, right? And this was a big current. The birth strike was a big current among the syndicalists, and the Marxists vehemently argued against it. The Marxists favored, they said people should have the right to abortion and should have the right to contraception, but birth strike, the idea that we should stop having children in order to fight capitalism or something, that's ludicrous. Rosa Luxemburg ripped it to shreds. The German Social Democratic Party ripped it to shreds. The notion of birth strike was something that the Marxist movement vehemently opposed. They vehemently opposed it. It was Malthusianism. What's interesting is that Sorel, who pushed birth strike, he was the ideological mentor of Benito Mussolini. Benito Mussolini dedicated his work to George Sorel. And also Franco in Spain, right? Franco, before he started the Falangist movement, they were the National Syndicalist movement, and they were also followers of George Sorel, right? So the Sorelian current was an attempt to hijack anti-capitalist and left-wing ideas and insert Malthusian ideas into them. Another big concept of George Sorel's is that instead of building a mass organization of working class people, you need to build this isolated group of very fanatical individuals. Thank you, Andy, for the super chat. This isolated group of very fanatical individuals that engage in violence and terrorism. Right? So the communists, the Marxists are trying to build mass groups of working class people, labor unions, community associations, socialist parties that will fight for working class people's rights. Sorel is saying, no. Build a little isolated, violent cult of extremists right? That's what you got to do. And these extremists, they'll impress people. They'll engage in violence, right? Propaganda of the deed, and people will look at them in awe, and they'll engage in violence. This is a pessimistic Malthusian view being inserted into the socialist movement, right? And I mean, it's not a secret that it is fact that that Benito Mussolini was on the payroll of British intelligence, right? That before he became the dictator of Italy, he was, being subsidized by the British to fight communists in Italy. He was, being subsidized by the British. So, there was some relationship between, British intelligence and Sorelianism. And it shouldn't be a surprise then the Sorelian current was promoting birth strike and Malthusianism, which was also the idea of the British ruling class. There's just too many working class people. So it's very interesting to think about. So a lot in here. Now, a couple things I wanted to talk about. I guess one more line that I thought was particularly amusing is, if I should fall to rise no more, as many comrades did before, that asked the fifes and drum to play over the hills and far away, then fall in, lads, behind the drum, with colors blazing like the sun, along the road to come what may, over the hills and far away. Now, the word comrade, right? When you use the word comrade as a Marxist, a lot of people roll their eyes. They think, what is this? Are you trying to LARP? But comrade is a word, okay? It's not a LARP, right? It's a real word with a real meaning. It's not only used by communists. The word is long before communists. This song, Over the Hills and Far Away, is not about communists. It's a pretty pro-imperialist song. But it says, if I should fall to rise no more, as many comrades did before, then ask the fifes. What is a comrade? A comrade is someone who you fight alongside, right? It's someone whom you fight alongside. A coworker is somebody you work with. A friend is someone you choose to associate with and have a friendship with. But a comrade is somebody you've been in a trench with. It's someone you've been in a struggle with. And it has a particular relationship that develops from people that fight alongside each other. They don't fight with each other. They're not fighting against each other. They're fighting alongside each other. Soldiers are comrades, right? Sometimes they'll refer to police officers as comrades. And it creates a special bond when one engages in struggle or fighting alongside someone else. That is a bonding experience that is particularly unique. And that is the bond that exists among communists. Communists have camaraderie or comradeship. It is a bond based on common struggle and depending on each other and supporting each other in the course of battle, right? And that's what it refers to. I believe in Russian, the word is tavarish, right? In Chinese, the word for comrade is actually, it translates to persons of common purpose, right? Communists, the relationship that communists have with other communists is that they are persons of common purpose. It's a special relationship. And this particular song is about British soldiers who have that relationship, right? Right? And that comrades, when they're fighting alongside each other, they can kind of, their energy feeds into each other. And it's a hard thing to explain. You have to have experienced it, which I have, and there are people watching who certainly have. But when you have comrades, it's not about having friends, it's not about having, co-workers, it's not about having, fellow members or something. When you have a comrade, when the two of you are fighting, and you are fighting passionately, you can feed off of each other's energy, right? And it gives you a feeling of empowerment and bravery. There are things that you can do when you have comrades that you could never do alone, right? Having a comrade, having camaraderie, being part of a group that is struggling for a common purpose, being people of a common purpose, being tavarish or being comrades, it gives you a certain empowerment. It gives you a feeling of boldness, right? When you can give up your individual purpose and be part of a cause bigger than yourself. When you can join arm in arm with your brothers to push back against a force that you feel is evil, to push forward for a cause that you believe in, it gives you a feeling of empowerment. It gives you a feeling of almost being bulletproof, right? It can lead to a feeling of exhilaration. that is just hard to explain. You have to have felt it, right? I can't prove it to you. There's probably people watching this that think this sounds like complete bullshit and think I made it up, but it's true, right? If you've experienced it, right? When we were at Occupy Wall Street, when we were, marching into the police, right? And the police were coming down on us, and it's a feeling that you have to experience, when I was at demonstrations, when I was when I was in a bank getting dragged out with people and getting arrested, it's a feeling you have to experience, right? That you suddenly feel far more powerful than you can feel upon your own. And suddenly it's like you transcend your own body. You transcend the weakness of being an individual, right? And that's what the stanza, the final stanza of the song is referring to, right? Then fallen lads behind the drum, with colors blazing like the sun, along the road to come what may, over the hills and far away. Right? This feeling that you're not afraid anymore. You're not afraid of death. You can look death right in the face. You become bold, right? Fallen lads behind the drum. You're marching in unity. You're marching in unity with colors blazing like the sun, along the road to come what may, meaning you're not afraid anymore. You're not fearing for your own life. You're not fearing for your own suffering because you are part of something bold and powerful. This is what it's describing, the relationship of comrades, of those who march into battle together, of those who take great risks together, of those people of common purpose. That's what it's referring to, right? And that cultivating this feeling of camaraderie is the way the British military was able to do what it was doing. You have to be able to cultivate that mindset in order to go and get people to go out and die for your empire. I mean, they were using these feelings for evil. Right? I mean, these feelings can be used for good, but they can also be used for evil. And the British were cultivating the comradism. They were cultivating that for evil. But it is an exuberant feeling. If you've ever, when I was in high school, I'd be in the marching band. And it's just this thrilling feeling you get when you're, I'd be there playing my trombone with, 100 other people. Bum, 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 bum. It gives you this exuberant feeling. Comradeship, right, is an exuberant feeling. And that is what the song is getting at. So this little ditty, this British military song, Over the Hills and Far Away, it is full of deep, profound meaning about imperialism, about empire, about, psychology, right? It talks about the resentment of apprentice Tom, who may now refuse to wipe his scoundrel master's shoes. It talks about there's references to Malthusianism. Thank you, Charles. References to Malthusianism. Courage, boys, is 1 to 10, but we'll return all gentlemen. Conquering colors we display over the hills and far away, right? They're going to gain their dignity. Courage, boys, is 1 to 10, but we'll return as gentlemen. We'll return not as redcoats they can kick out of the restaurant, right? We'll return all gentlemen. Conquering colors we display, right? Taking down other countries' flags, beating down people over the hills and far away. Fallen lads behind the drum, with colors blazing like the sun, along the road to come what may, over the hills and far away. This is a deeply profound piece of writing. It's deeply profound. Whoever wrote this song, it was deeply profound. It sounds like just a childish ditty, right? It sounds like just a silly, marching song or something, but it's full of a deeply profound psychological, historical, insightful, economic message. This is how the British built their military, right? If you can understand the lyrics to this silly British Army marching song, you can understand the way imperialism works, but you can also understand the way out. The way out. Because our job as communists, our job as anti-imperialists, our job as progressives is to reverse this, right? To not let the imperialists hijack the rage of working people, but instead to turn that rage into class solidarity, to redirect the anger of working people. And instead of having them be sent to Africa and Asia and the Middle East to beat down and colonize people, have them join arm in arm with the colonized people of the world to stand against the empire and to beat back the billionaire bankers and bosses who are colonizing and degrading all of us around the world, right? It is our duty as communists to build that feeling of comradeship between all mankind, black and white, Latino, Arab, Asian, black, all together against the imperialists, right? You know, to build a feeling of exuberance and strength and camaraderie that can actually bring down the empire, right? To get over the manipulations of imperialism, to get over this notion that people can gain their dignity by beating down somebody else, but instead to build international solidarity, to build international anti-imperialism, to get the working people of the first world to understand that their future does not lie with the bankers and billionaire bosses and monopolists. It doesn't lie with the phony labor bureaucrats and labor aristocracy. It doesn't lie with social dumbocracy and phony, worker co-op schemes. It lies in solidarity with the people around the world. It lies in dismantling the system of profits and command. It lies in dismantling the global system of monopoly capitalism, where a few big bankers rule the world and keep the rest of the world poor in order to get rich. And furthermore, there are not too many working people in the world. There are not enough working people in the world. The problem isn't that there are too many of us. The problem is that we only have value in this system if we can make money for a boss, that the capitalist doesn't have any place for us at the assembly line, and that the capitalists have gotten so good at producing technology and producing products that there's no place for us in their assembly line. So the time has come for we, the working people, who stand outcast and starving mid the wonders that we have made, the time has come for us to seize control of the factories and seize control of the banks and seize control of all the centers of economic power and organize them to serve the people and to build a beautiful, exuberant society, lifting the strength of all the people and the courage and the potential of each individual to build a world full of prosperity and joy and material abundance, and to populate the earth like it's never been populated before, to go into outer space, to colonize Mars, to colonize the moon, to do amazing, unprecedented things, to take technology to higher levels than ever, to build a world with so much prosperity and so much abundance that all inequality breaks down. The need for a government vanishes. The need for prisons and police and laws vanishes. People can just take what they want and do what they feel like doing, from each according to his own ability, to each according to his needs. All of this can be accomplished if we get beyond the system where profits are in command, if we get beyond the system where money comes first, when human beings can reclaim their dignity by claiming control of the means of production. If we can get to that point, if we can have a rationally organized economy, we can get beyond the horrors of a world where the only dignity a person can ever dream of gaining is the dignity of beating down somebody else the way they themselves have been beaten down. That is the hope, that is the message of Marxism and anti-imperialism. And I'm glad that I was able to communicate it to you by reciting a British Army marching song. So thank you very much. That was my opening remarks. Names and locations. I'll call you out as I see you. Thank you, old gringo. All right, names and locations. I'll call you out as I see you. Raphael in Brazil. New York, Hungary, fantastic. Montreal, Chaya is with us. Io in Manhattan. Brad in St. Louis. KCMO, hello. Solid opening. Michigan, very good rant. Caleb. Cincinnati, Ohio. Jenny Lynn, West Palm Beach. Cleveland Pirate Alex. Mo in Toronto. Yugoslavia. Oklahoma. Chicago. Ryan in Oakland. Max the Sax in D.C. West Palm Beach. BT in the mountains of Vermont, Southampton, Joe Gale in Nassau County, New York, JT24, Mississippi, Vallejo, California, West Palm Beach, Santiago de Chile, San Antonio, Texas, Seattle, Loving the Streams Boss, Cincinnati, Joel Springs, Tristan in Maryland, Comrade Wu in Beijing, China, Fabulous, Caleb says William Kane, Brazil, Ramiro in East LA, shout out to Ramiro, check out his new documentary on Nicaragua, it's amazing. Bulgaria, North Carolina, Dust James, West Palm Beach, Lockport, New York, Los Angeles, Walking Around a Lake, says Red Illuminati, Adelaide, Australia, Nigeria, Monroe, North Carolina, New York, Nashville, Tennessee, David from Michigan, good stuff, Caleb, Cupertino, California, Caracas, Venezuela, big fan from the UK, the Netherlands, Longview, Washington, still awake in the UK, Mohsen from Iran, Tamara and Dario from Brooklyn, Auckland, New Zealand, Arturo from Alaska, Melbourne, Australia, keep it up, Caleb, Mo in Pomona, California, thank you for your masterclass, Tara Hoot, great opening, Neil from Facebook again, New Jersey, Joey from McKees Rocks, John in Houston, Alan from Chicago. Are you related to Bill Still? I don't know who Bill Still is. Kendall in San Diego, Tomasino, Minneapolis, Yugoslavia, UK, top, very, very good stuff. Leipzig, East Germany, very, very good. Branson, Missouri, good stuff. Natalie in Baltimore, she's got good stuff on the TikTok, actually. Natalie, here, I'll make Natalie. Natalie is now a moderator. There we go. All righty. Mulberry Street, Bagelstein. Oh, is that an anti-Semitic thing? My goodness. Someone just tricked me into saying something anti-Semitic. My goodness. All right. There we go. There we go. What else? What else do we got here? Baltimore native. Very good. It's someone's 18th birthday. Well, congratulations to you. Wrench Gang. Welcome to the Wrench Gang, Natalie. North of Detroit. There you go. Very, very good. All right. Welcome else. Anybody else? Names and locations. Names and locations. Names and locations. Names and locations. Anybody else? Anybody else? Be sure to hit the like button. Be sure to hit the subscribe button. Be sure to hit the notifications bell. Zephyr from Eugene, Oregon, welcome. East Germany is the best Germany, says somebody. Phoenix, Arizona, Arthur Porter. Shout out to you, Arthur. There we go. I will come to the UK eventually, right? I'll be there soon. I've got plenty of people I want to see over there. Bill Still is the guy who made the Jekyll Island movie, Anti-Federal Reserve dude. Oh, man. There's true things in the book, but the narrative is ridiculous. The idea that J.P. Morgan was a communist, really? Come on. I mean, Bircher, that guy was a Bircher, I believe. Names and locations, all of East Germany should be DDR. 11 BreadTubers here tonight. Well, I hope more of them come and break with BreadTube, right? The BreadTube book is finishing up. Caleb will come to China first, says T. Very funny. So there you go. Well, no, I can go to China. I got to travel. That's what I got to do. I got to travel. But yeah, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. The BreadTube book is pretty much done. I need to add some different sections to it. But it's basically done. I read over the whole thing today. And the BreadTube book is almost done. It's going to be good. I have to add some stuff. I have a lot of revisions I have to make, but it's gonna be good. It's gonna be good stuff. So if you have any more super chat questions, send them my way. I will answer. I will send you an answer if you send me a super chat. So there you go. All righty. Okay. So the first super chat question I got was, which synthetic left did the most damage? Well, I would say that the synthetic left, what do you mean which synthetic left? It's all one entity, basically. But if you're asking which action of the synthetic left was the most dangerous, I would argue that the role that the synthetic left played in the fall of the Soviet Union, that moment was very, very key. When the Soviet Union was falling, the fact that leftists around the world almost unanimously supported it. Not, in the West, I should say, not in the developing world, but around the West. The fall of the Soviet Union, we saw almost unanimous support for the fall of the Soviet Union, in Western countries. The Communist Party, they came out against it at the last minute, which was good, but it was really late, right? They'd been going along with everything. The Workers' World Party, to their credit, they stood their ground and they opposed the fall of the Soviet Union. They denounced perestroika and all of that. And they, all the Trotskyites, the SWP and the ISO and all the Trotskyites, they were out in the streets marching in support of the overthrow of socialism. The argument that the SWP used is they said, well, the economics of socialism isn't being overturned. It's simply the police state apparatus that's being overturned, and this will pave the way for a real proletarian revolution. Oops, you know. Yeah, the SWP, they were out there supporting all of it. The ISO, interestingly, the International Socialist Organization, they supported the fall of the Soviet Union, and they said on the grounds that they said, yeah, we know it'll lead to the, I mean, there's apparently one line from the ISO where they said, yeah, we know that overthrowing the Soviet Union will lead to, OWS fail, will lead to the Western imperialists coming in. But even that is an advance over Stalinism. So they basically admitted they're imperialist shills, and they were on board with it. And actually, I've made this point before, but I can't make it enough. This nasty word, red-brown alliance, that you hear now. It's all this red-brown alliance, right? Red-brown alliance, red-brown alliance, right? That term, red-brown alliance, goes back to that. Because after the Soviet Union fell, when they had an election, right, the people of Russia, the Russian Federation, voted for a parliament that would stop austerity, right? Because the economic cuts that Boris Yeltsin was carrying out were killing people, right? I mean, opioids were flowing into the country. There was mass unemployment, mass hunger, and the population of Russia between 1992 and the early 2000s went down by 10%. 1 in 10 people either died or left the country. And so they voted for a parliament that would stop the cuts. The biggest party in that parliament was the Communist Party of the Russian Federation. But there were also some nationalist parties that were voted in. Some Russian nationalist parties. I forget the names of them, but and some of those Russian nationalist parties, it's true, were anti-Semitic. And I understand that there was even some anti-Semites in the Russian Communist Party. Because you have to remember that in the 1980s, the USA put sanctions on the USSR because the USSR had allegedly been persecuting Soviet Jews. The Soviet Union was anti-Israel. The USA was supporting Israel. When the Soviet Union fell, a lot of Soviet Jews just fled to Israel. So they weren't there suffering. And so there was a lot of anti-Semitism at the time the Soviet Union fell. But the economic cuts were happening in the Russian economy. And people were hungry and starving and all that. So they went to the ballot box and they voted for the Communist Party and they voted for Russian nationalists, anyone who said they would stop the austerity. And so they got elected and they had this parliament, the Duma, that, in 1993, this Duma that was going to stop the austerity that was killing people in Russia. And then the president of Russia, Boris Yeltsin, who was a good friend of Bill Clinton, was pro-Western, totally pro-Western. What he did was he dissolved the parliament. And he said, well, I don't have to recognize this parliament that the Russian people voted for, not because they hate Jews, not because they're evil Stalinists, but because they want to stop starving to death and dying. I'm going to dissolve this parliament that they did because it's a red-brown alliance, because it's got communists, and it's got nationalists in it. And so I don't have to recognize it. Sure, the people voted for it. Sure, they're trying to stop the austerity. Sure, my policies of austerity are a disaster. But, this parliament that the Russian people voted for, it's a red-brown alliance. And those were the words used by Boris Yeltsin to justify shutting down the parliament. It's an austerity propaganda term. Anyone who uses the term red-brown alliance, you should immediately hear that word and go bing, 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 and think of piles of dead bodies. That's millions of dead bodies, right? Austerity must go on because the people against it are red-browns. That's basically what it was. That was a term, the term for what happened after the fall of the Soviet Union. Anders Gunter Frank, a highly respected economist, called it economic genocide. Economic genocide. Red-brown alliance is an economic genocide buzzword. There's all this talk about dog whistles and all of that. Red-brown alliance is an economic genocide buzzword. It's a word that was used to justify Yeltsin sending the military to shell the parliament, killing 187 people who went out to protest against him, attacking the parliament, and then doing so he could continue economic policies that ultimately reduced the Russian population by 10%, right? There you go. Reduce the population by 10%, right? That's what that term was used for. I'm not okay with anti-Semitism, right? I don't think anyone should be demonized on the basis of their race or their ethnic group or their religion. So that's not the issue here. But the people of Russia didn't vote for the Communist Party. They didn't vote for these Russian nationalist parties because they were full of hatred. They voted for them because they wanted the food to stop being taken out of their mouths. They wanted the old people to stop starving in the streets. I mean, the fall of the Soviet Union was an economic disaster. And, you had to support it, because if you didn't, you were supporting the Red-Brown Alliance. And the memo went out, and all these Trotskyites and all of them, a couple parties, the Workers' World Party, the Communist Party USA, did march against the attack on the Russian parliament, but the majority of leftists went along with it because they said, the people that are in the parliament are a Red-Brown Alliance, and we can't support that. And so on the basis of, some members of the Russian parliament, the Duma, said anti-Semitic things, on that basis, the left, the United States left, the Trotskyites, the anarchids, the social democrats, they all went along with the economic genocide committed against Russia and the Eastern Bloc, the former countries of the Eastern Bloc. They all went along with it in the name of, we don't want to be part of a Red-Brown Alliance. So as soon as you hear that phrase, Red-Brown Alliance, an alarm bell should go off in your head, because anyone who's using that term, they probably are just repeating it. But if they knew the history of that term, they wouldn't use it, right? They wouldn't use it. They would not use it, because that term, Red-Brown Alliance, is a term that is used to justify economic genocide. So there you go. So I would say that probably the worst thing done by the synthetic left was when they went along with the fall of the Soviet Union. All right. Okay, so there's two super chats here. One is about Palestinian left, and the other is about non-Hamas Palestine fighters. And I guess I'll combine it with Hezbollah too, because we'll just do it all real quick, right? We gotta be careful how we talk about these things so that somebody doesn't take it out of context and say I'm supporting terrorism or something. Okay, so I noticed that a lot of people in the United States think Hamas and Hezbollah are the same thing, and they're not. Okay, so let's talk about who Hamas is, and we'll talk about who Hezbollah is, and then we'll talk about the other groups. All right, so Hamas is the Palestinian wing of the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood, they've been around in the Middle East since the 1920s. They are Muslims who believe in free market capitalism and technology and reject all Arab nationalism. They're very anti-communist. It's an association of Muslim small business owners, basically. It was started in Egypt in the 1920s, and in the 1950s, the CIA started giving them lots of money because they killed and assassinated communists. It's the Muslim Brotherhood, and it's a group of Muslims in the Middle East and North Africa and a lot of different places, and they oppose communism because it's not Muslim, it's not Islamic. They believe in free market capitalism. Their belief is that capitalism is fine as long as everyone is a good Muslim and pays charity and follows the Quran. You don't need socialism. They reject Arab nationalism, and they argue that all Muslims are equal. And so Turkey has always been very close to the Muslim Brotherhood current because, Turkey colonized the Arabs, and the Arabs resisted the Turks on the basis of Arab nationalism. Well, the Muslim Brotherhood comes along and says, there's no Arabs, there's no Turks, we're all Muslims, there is no nation. So it's been supported on that basis. That's the Muslim Brotherhood. And in Egypt, they were used by the United States. The CIA basically paid them and armed them to attack and assassinate, Arab socialists and communists. And in the 1960s and 70s and 80s, they spread throughout the Middle East. They're the Muslim Brotherhood. In Syria, the Muslim Brotherhood staged an uprising to try and overthrow Assad in the 1980s. The Ba'ath government in Syria, there was an armed CIA-backed uprising by the Muslim Brotherhood against Assad in the 80s. That's the Muslim Brotherhood. So Hamas is the Palestinian wing of the Muslim Brotherhood. And it is now a matter of public record that Israel armed and funded Hamas during the 1980s to fight against the communist wing of Palestinian resistance. So that's a fact. That's who Hamas are. Hamas are the Palestinian wing of the Muslim Brotherhood. So that's that, right? And at this point, the Muslim Brotherhood viewpoint is promoted by Turkey and Qatar. Turkey and Qatar, basically. And that's the Muslim Brotherhood current. They're pro-elected governments. They believe in elections and stuff. They're not for a monarchy. They're not Wahhabis. They're pro-technology, but they're really pro-capitalism. And in Iran, they refer to the Muslim Brotherhood as westernized Muslims because they embrace Western capitalism, because they embrace the Western, liberal democratic model. When I actually saw the supreme leader of Iran, when he spoke, I was at the mausoleum to Khamenei, and that was a life-changing experience. And I sat there with my my translator earpiece in, and I listened to a speech by the supreme leader of Iran. He denounced both Wahhabi Islam and westernized Islam. And westernized Islam is what he referred to, that's the Muslim Brotherhood. And Wahhabi, that's ISIS, that's Saudi Arabia. So that's what he was referring to. That's the Muslim Brotherhood. Hamas is the Palestinian wing of the Muslim Brotherhood. Okay? Hezbollah is a completely different group. Hezbollah is in Lebanon. They're not in Palestine, they're in Lebanon. And Hezbollah it's a result of the fact that in the 1980s, Israel invaded Lebanon, and the people in Lebanon were forming different armed groups to fight and resist. And they were getting, guns together, and they were fighting the Israelis, the Israeli invaders, right? I mean, it's just kind of what goes on. And they were forming different groups, and Iran started arming the different groups. And there's I think it was every local village had a group, basically, and they all had different names when Hezbollah started. One of the groups some of the names of the groups that eventually merged into Hezbollah are really badass. One of the names is the Organization of the Oppressed on Earth. That was actually the name of one of these armed resistance groups to Israel, was the Organization of the Oppressed on Earth. What kind of badass name is that? I want to join the Organization of the Oppressed on Earth. And it's the organization, you'd think it would just be Organization of the Oppressed, but it was the Organization of the Oppressed on Earth, meaning they will be the victors in heaven. It's badass like that. After Armageddon, we're going to be in charge. But yeah, every little village in Lebanon had its own resistance group to Israel, armed resistance group. Iran started, this was after the Islamic Revolution, Iran started giving guns to the different groups, and eventually they merged into one group, Hezbollah. And Hezbollah, they are Shia Muslims, right? Hamas are Sunnis, Muslim Brotherhood. Hezbollah are Shia Muslims. And they were an armed resistance group to Israel in Lebanon. I think they blew up a U.S. military base at one point in the 80s. They bombed a U.S. military base and killed a large number of U.S. troops in Lebanon. They're Shia Muslims, and they have evolved from being I shouldn't say terrorist group, but they've evolved from being an armed faction, right? They've evolved from that into being a political party, right? Now they are the largest, I think they're the largest political party in Lebanon, right? They're half of the government of Lebanon is Hezbollah, and they're a political party. And they control half the country, basically, yeah, it's Hezbollah. And I will say that Hezbollah, they are Shia Muslims, but they are much more anti-capitalist than any other religious current in the Middle East. I mean, they're Shia Muslims, they're sympathetic to Iran, and their leader is Nasrallah. And they are much more anti-capitalist. As they were rebuilding, when Israel invaded Lebanon, the most recent invasion, as they were rebuilding it, they were building, statues and paintings of Hugo Chavez and of Che Guevara. And they condemn capitalism. And Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, is a Ramiro took the words right out of my mouth, very effective orator. And yeah, I mean, they're a political party and they're a Shia Muslim political party and armed group in Lebanon. And yes, there are Christian members of the group. There are communists. The Communist Party of Lebanon is aligned with Hezbollah in the government, in the parliament. And they are the anti-imperialist force. They're a political party and an armed group in Lebanon that, they basically, they're a big chunk of the government in Lebanon. Totally different than Hamas, completely different than Hamas, right? Politically, economically speaking, they're in different countries. So people who think Hamas and Hezbollah are the same, they're delusional. Now, that's Hamas and Hezbollah. Those are the two, Hamas, that's in Lebanon, Hezbollah, that's in Gaza, right? So then other groups. Sorry. Whew. other groups, in Palestine. So you have the Islamic Jihad in Palestine, and that's Shia Muslims. That's like, they're kind of like Hezbollah, but they're in Palestine, they're in Gaza. And there's Shia Muslims, the IJP, they're called the Islamic Jihad in Palestine, and they're like they're sympathizers with Iran, and they're Shia Muslims. So there's that. There's also the PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. That's a Marxist-Leninist organization. I guess the divide among the Palestinian resistance is whether or not it's two-state versus one-state. So, what they call Fatah, which is the coalition the Palestinian resistance is divided into two camps. There's Hamas, which is, Hamas, and then there's Fatah. Fatah argues that it recognizes Israel, says Israel has a right to exist, but it needs to go back to the 1967 borders. Whereas Hamas says Israel has no right to exist at all. So, right, one state, the idea is no, Israel needs to be overthrown, and a government that represents all the people living in that area needs to be created. That's the one state. Two state is there will be an Israel and there will be a Palestinian state, but Fatah argues that the 1967 borders, Israel needs to get everyone back to the 1967 borders, so that if Israel got back to the 1967 borders, there would be an end to the conflict, right? That's the idea. So Fatah tends to be, I believe Fatah includes the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the DFLP. I think there's something called the People's Party, which is the Palestinian People's Party. And those are groups that argue that Israel has the right to exist, but should go back to the 67 borders. And they're represented in the UN. That's the Palestinian, the Palestinian Authority. Hamas, does not recognize Israel having any right to exist, therefore, completely eradicating the Israeli state and having a government, one state that represents the entire population of that area. And Hamas is aligned with the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the PFLP, which is the DFLP is two state. The PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, is one state. There's also the from what I understand, there's the what else? There used to be something called the Arab Liberation Organization, ALO, and that was Baathists that were in Palestine. So yeah, the Islamic Jihad in Palestine takes the Hamas position there, for a one-state solution. And that's the Palestinian resistance. DFLP, PFLP, IJP, Hamas, and ALO, Arab Liberation Organization. There you go. The leader of the PFLP is Layla Khalid. It's a woman, and she is kind of a folk hero among the Palestinians because she did some very exciting acts of terrorism. She hijacked some airplanes. She was in prison in Israel, and then they traded her. There was they took some prisoners. The Palestinians kidnapped some people, and then they made I think it was the Olympic athletes, right, that were kidnapped at the Olympics, and then they traded Layla Khalid. They let her out of prison in exchange for the Olympic athletes being released. And Layla Khalid, she hijacked some airplanes, and she's seen as this very heroic figure among the Palestinians for what she did during the 1970s. She was this very, very well-known woman fighter for the Palestinians, Layla Khalid. So there you go. And she's the leader of the PFLP. So there you go. Okay, and forgive me if I made some mistakes there. This is not my area of huge amount of expertise, but that's what I know. I guess I know more than most people, but there's somebody in there who says that I'm wrong about the PFLP, and they may be right, okay? If I'm wrong about that, I stand corrected, that the PFLP may be two-state. I'm not sure of that. I could swear the PFLP is a one-state group, but I could be wrong, and I've been wrong before about these things. Yeah, that's what I know about the Palestinian resistance. That's the different groups that I'm aware of. There was a war at one point. I mean, Hamas won the elections. You'll recall there was like, at one point Hamas and Fatah were fighting each other. There was armed conflict. So yeah, there you go. Okay. All righty. So someone asked about a new housing bubble. A new housing bubble. I think it was Red Illuminati asked about a new housing bubble. Well, the thing is, the housing bubble right now, the cost of rent and property values in urban centers like New York City, where I'm talking to you from, I'm in Manhattan right now, is going down. Rent in New York City is unbelievably, it's like the rent has dropped very much. I ought to move, honestly, while I still can, because it's like unbelievable. But that in and of itself is not what the housing bubble was, okay? The housing bubble is a little bit more complicated than that. Yes, a lot of capitalists are losing money because the housing values are going down in urban centers. That's true. But that in and of itself, the housing bubble of 2007, 2008, what that was that Americans were not buying homes. And it was largely in the suburbs, and it was in rural areas and in the suburbs. Americans were just not buying homes. And so Alan Greenspan lobbied Congress to legalize all kinds of lending practices to keep Americans buying homes, right? Because think about all the parts of the U.S. economy that are dependent on people buying homes. Think about it, right? Homes, that's lumber, that's steel, that's electricians, that's carpenters, the housing industry, building houses is a huge part of the U.S. economy. And so if Americans just stopped buying houses, the economy would crash. So Alan Greenspan basically was sitting there in the Federal Reserve saying, how do we keep Americans buying houses when they just can't afford it anymore? Look, the industrial jobs have been shipped overseas, right? The wages that the next generation are making in the service sector are very low. Americans just cannot afford to keep buying houses. So Alan Greenspan legalized all kinds of predatory lending practices. Nietzsche and Carl Jung. All right. Legalized all kinds of predatory lending practices in order to basically all kinds of money lending that was not previously legal. And the reason he did that was to keep Americans buying houses. Because if Americans stopped buying houses, the economy would come to a grinding halt. Well, that only worked for so long. And, if you get a loan and you can't pay it back, what happens? Your home gets foreclosed on. And so all across the United States, banks were foreclosing on houses, and it was eventually the housing bubble burst. It was just basically the living standards of Americans had gone down so significantly that they were just not buying houses. That's a little bit different than in the urban centers of the United States, where the property values are still very high, right? New York City, it's still, even with everything going on, it's still got one of the highest real estate prices in the country, right? Buying property in New York City, in Manhattan, forget it. It's really expensive. Even out in Brooklyn, if people buy a house in Brooklyn, not an apartment, but a house in Brooklyn, you're looking at like $1 million, right? New York City real estate is very, very expensive because this is the playground of the whole world. All the rich people from all over the world come to New York City to play around, right? The rich kids from Hong Kong, the rich kids from Singapore, the rich kids from Africa, and the rich kids from South America. All the Venezuelan right-wing people all live here in New York. And rich kids, New York City is basically a playground for rich people, right? And because of that, even though average Americans can't afford to keep buying homes, doesn't matter, right? The rich people from all over the world come here to play around. And a lot of these ultra-rich people, they've got an apartment here, and they've got an apartment in Paris, and they've got an apartment in Hong Kong, and they don't care. They're millionaires. They're billionaires. They don't care, right? And New York City, they talk about hipster culture, Williamsburg, the Lower East Side. These places are a lot of they're like playgrounds for rich kids. And so because they're playgrounds for rich kids, the real estate prices just kept going up. Even though even though, it became less and less affordable to live in the city. And the Bronx, many people talked about, the Bronx was basically, where everyone who worked in, it's a tragedy, right? But, it's like you have the Bronx, which is, the Bronx is the poorest county in the entire United States, right? It is the poorest county in the entire United States, the Bronx. And, it's like basically Manhattan, certain parts of Brooklyn, Williamsburg, downtown Brooklyn. It's like, these are playgrounds for rich people. And the Bronx is full of very, very poor people and immigrants, a lot of them undocumented and very poor people who live in the Bronx and are impoverished, and live in like utter poverty. But they take the train from the Bronx and they come in and they serve food and they mop the floors and they do the work in the most expensive, like this playground for rich kids. And because these areas are like playgrounds for rich kids, the price of real estate goes up. And even beyond that, there's what's called real estate speculation, which is that increasingly, there's a lot of apartment buildings I could show you in this city that are almost empty, right? Sabra and Shatila, that are just empty. And they're just empty. And the people who own the building have no intention of filling them up. And the reason for that is because the owners of the building don't make money by people actually living in them. The real estate in New York is so valuable that you buy the building, you wait for the market, to change, and then you sell the building, right? And then it's like gambling. It's like buying stock and selling stock, right? And so on top of that, you have all these apartments and buildings that are, no one's living in them. And all of that. Plus, so that's all until the pandemic. So the pandemic comes along. That's, it's been about a year and a half. We've had pandemic stuff going on. Well, with the pandemic, this city is not a playground for rich people anymore. Right? All this stuff rich people did, go to hipster bars, go to Broadway, go to rave nightclub, all that's gone. You can't do that with the pandemic going on. So the rich people are out of here. They're gone. As a result, property values in New York City have plummeted. They have just gone down because all the people that made the property values just keep going up. All these rich people that are traveling from country to country to country and live in Paris and live in Hong Kong and live in Chicago and go from country to country, they can't travel anymore and they're not partying. And so the property values have plummeted. So there you go. Meanwhile, a lot of the very, very poor people in the Bronx and all of that don't have jobs to do because all the restaurants are closed, so they're hungry and they're poor. And yeah, New York City is feeling it. This is not a good time for New York City. I'll tell you that. I take the train to work every day. This is a bad time for New York City. New York City has been hit pretty hard. You walk around the streets, the amount of homeless people you see, the amount of hungry people, it's pretty awful. And so, someone asked, is the housing bubble going to burst? Well, the housing bubble was that, I don't feel like the property values in rural areas and in the suburbs are being as badly hit. Right now, it's like the opposite, right? So when the housing bubble burst in 2008, it was New York City, Chicago, these kind of, these gentrified urban centers throughout the country. Those were the places that did okay because the property values kept rising there because the rich kids just went there to party. Meanwhile, it was the suburbs and it was rural areas that saw the housing prices go down. Now the pandemic hasn't devastated the housing prices in the suburbs, hasn't really devastated the housing prices in the rural areas. It's devastated the urban centers, the gentrified urban centers, right, where they've kicked out all the black and brown people who've lived there for generations. And it's like rich white kids and rich international kids party all the time. They can't party all the time. So it's devastated it. One of the wildest stories I got to tell you is that it's worth pointing this out. It's kind of funny, but I became aware of this and it just made me shake my head. But, the U.S. South, right? The South, Alabama, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, again, Oklahoma, these states have a reputation as being quite conservative, right? And rich people don't like those states. Rich white people tend to be liberal, or at least socially liberal. Maybe they're libertarian economically, but rich white people tend to be quite socially liberal. And the reputation that southern states in the United States have is that they're all rednecks, right? They're all in the Ku Klux Klan. They're all, racist, ignorant, white trash. It's this classist stereotype that all the poor people are all a bunch of socially conservative, racist rednecks. That's the stereotype. Tennessee, Kentucky, thank you, Dust James. They have this reputation. And it was a bit of a problem because, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, Nashville, cities like that. Cities in the South were trying to gentrify. They were trying to have, a playground for rich kids downtown. Bank of America, right? The biggest bank in the United States is headquartered in Charlotte, North Carolina. Charlotte, North Carolina is where you'll find the biggest bank in the country, right? They're headquartered there. And there's a lot of rich banking execs who live in Charlotte, North Carolina. But they don't want to, right? Because, they're, again, rich, wealthy, finance kind of people. You say to them, you want to go live in North Carolina? They go, I don't want to live in North Carolina. A bunch of they don't say it like that. I don't want to live in North Carolina. There are a bunch of hillbillies down there. I don't want to go live with those racist white trash hillbillies. Right? Rich white people don't want to live in the South. So this has been a problem when you're trying to gentrify Atlanta, and when you're trying to gentrify Charlotte, North Carolina. It's a problem. So there have been NGOs that are tied to the Democratic Party that have staged protests in these cities, okay? You can't make this up. There are certain NGOs in North Carolina that will not be named, certain NGOs in South Carolina that will not be named, certain NGOs in Atlanta that will not be named, that are funded by Bank of America and funded by big tobacco companies to protest around Black Lives Matter and trans rights and trendy liberal causes in southern cities in order to help gentrify them. You can't make this up. You can't make this up. But I am well aware, because of some intense personal conflicts and not so personal political conflicts I've been in, that there are nonprofits where Bank of America and, tobacco companies and big Wall Street institutions pay liberal kids to go out and have demonstrations in Charlotte, North Carolina, where Bank of America is headquartered, in Atlanta and places like that, and have liberal rallies and anti-racist rallies, so it will attract rich white people to move to these areas and kick out all the low-income black folks who live there. If you want rich white people to move to your southern town, you have to have a bunch of protests for trans rights and a bunch of protests for Black Lives Matter happening. It's the best way to make sure that rich white people move to your town, is to have a bunch of woke protests there. So there are literally big banks paying hipster kids, setting up nonprofits. I could name some names. I'm not going to do that. Maybe they'll sue me. I don't know. Paying them to protest against racism so that the property values go up and they can kick the poor African-American folks out of these cities. It's happening. Trust me, I can point you to sort of some people who can swear by this fact. That NGO money is being handed out to southern liberal activists to help gentrify southern cities. Because part of what makes rich white people want to move to southern cities is if they look all woke, right? And if they can roll back the idea that these are a bunch of redneck, white trash, Ku Klux Klan cities, right? If they can have a trans rights rally, if they can have a rally for Black Lives Matter, and you can't make this up, but it's happening. It is absolutely happening, and I know people who are involved in it, and I know people who blew the whistle on it and talked about how fake and bullshit it was, and it's just happening. Look, the protest, NGO-cialism, right? Where it's like, we get a grant from a big company to stage rallies about social justice this stuff is toxic, right? The revolution will not be funded. That stuff is toxic. It's very, very toxic, right? It's very, very toxic. The fact that a lot of these socialists or whatever, think that they're leading the revolution because they've maneuvered into a situation where they work for some liberal foundation that writes them a check so they can, they can stage rallies around whatever the latest CNN liberal cause is. And it's a shame because a lot of leftists, a lot of socialists have fallen into this. Dust James, the non-profit industrial complex. That's what it is. And it's, in a lot of cases, it's blatantly a vehicle for gentrification. It's about making cities more attractive to rich white people. I kid you not, right? They say they're woke, they say they're fighting for black people, but it's about, at the end of the day, the goal of these corporations is to make the property values go up and make more rich white people want to move to Charlotte, North Carolina, so they can kick out the low-income black people and be woke. And yeah, there you go. Okay, alrighty, housing bubble. A real counter-hegemonic culture. Well, it's interesting because in one of Michael Parenti's books, and this was from Chaya asked about, what about a real counterculture, not something fake? In one of Michael Parenti's books, he talks about how there used to be a vast working class culture before television was invented. Working class people had their own songs. Working class people had their own community associations. Working class people, there was a vast working class culture that people had because they had to entertain themselves. Like in New York City, every ethnic group you ever heard of had an ethnic association. And it wasn't just like and there's people doing that now, but it's like a dinner they go to once a year or something. But no, it was this ethnic association, it had a choir, it had a marching band, the Italians, the Lithuanians, there was an ethnic association. There used to be all kinds of working class songs and, working class games kids would play on the street. And that, before the rise of television had the ability of giving, though everyone had a TV in the 50s. And the TV set the standard. It set the point of reference, right? There were 3 channels, 5 channels. Everyone watched those channels, and through those channels learned the same party line. And that was a big shift because it used to be that in a lot of working class communities, there was a vast working class culture, whether it was from ethnic groups, and in a lot of cases it was socialist, right? Look, the Communist Party of the United States, the basis for the Communist Party when it was formed was what was called the Foreign Language Federations. And these were not explicitly communist groups. It was just when people would come to the United States from Latvia and Lithuania and Moldova and Italy and Ireland. Well, not Ireland, they speak English, but when they would come to the United States, they would come and they wouldn't speak the language. And the people working in the steel mills and working in the meat packing facilities often did not speak English. And so they would have to, if they didn't speak English, they would have to go and join a foreign language federation. That would help them, write legal documents, help them negotiate leases for their rent, help them do stuff they couldn't do if they didn't speak the language. It was called a Foreign Language Federation. And part of the way the Socialist Party recruited many immigrants was by setting up foreign language federations. The foreign language federations of every Eastern European ethnic group you ever heard of the Italians, of the Irish, the Slavic peoples, they were all dominated by socialists. Socialists kind of ran these they were called foreign language federations that were like community services, right? That if you didn't speak English and you needed to get, a contract written, or you needed to take somebody to court, or you needed to do something, that you could go to the Foreign Language Federation. They could speak to you in your native tongue, and they could work it out. And the Socialist Party set these foreign language federations up, and they were largely socialist dominated. And when the when the Communist Party was formed, it was the foreign language federations that were associated with the Socialist Party that formed the Communist Party. First, there was the Communist Party and the Communist Labor Party. Communist Labor Party was English speaking, and it was the foreign language federations that was the Communist Party. So, and eventually they merged into one group. But at first, there was the Communist Party and the Communist Labor Party. John Reed and the English-speaking folks were in the Communist Labor Party. Communist Party was the foreign language federation. Neighborhood garage meetings with reel-to-reel movies, playing cards, playing records, letter by mail from various organizations. I'm old enough to remember, it says old gringo. Yeah, and I mean, part of this is just technology, right? Is that just technology changes. But one of the big changes from switching from not TV to TV was that TV set like a hegemonic culture. Now, interestingly though, I would argue that now it's being kind of reversed. Because YouTube and the internet gives people the ability to carve out their own little world, right? We don't, TV gave us all a common point of reference, but now with the internet, you all are watching me, right? There's a couple thousand people that are around this YouTube channel. There's 16,000 subscribers total, but every video gets 1,000 to 2,000 views, sometimes 2,000 to 3,000, right? We're not mainstream. If you went around, if you went to work tomorrow and made a joke about unnamed diet beverage, your coworkers would look at you and go, what? And you'd hear the crickets, cricket, cricket, cricket. And you'd be like, unnamed orange beverage. And it would be like cricket, cricket, cricket. It's our inside joke, right? They wouldn't get it, right? This isn't a common point of reference. And YouTube kind of gives, once again, we have like people having their own little niche. We don't have the Lithuanian-Latvian Association anymore. We don't have the Italian Americans Club. We don't have the Moldovan Bloc Association. We have YouTube. So, it's funny because Timothy Leary, who was an FBI informer and was promoting the drug thing, there's a speech he gave in the 80s, though, where he's talking about, like, TV, man, it's like brainwashing, dude. And TV, man, is brainwashing. And who controls the screen, man? He controls society. But we're going to come up with this technology where, like, we control the screen, man. It's going to be crazy. Like, we're going to be able to make our own TV. So we're going to, with the screen, control society, dude. It's going to be so amazing, man. It's going to be the human brain is like a computer, and you're going to have a computer, and you can control the TV. The TV will be in the computer, and you'll control it, man. It's amazing. Do drugs. It's funny. I'll dig up the talk. It's hilarious, right? It's like, after he got out of prison, in the 80s, before he died, Timothy Leary went on speaking tours, and all the druggies would come see him, but he would promote tech optimism. That was his thing, as he was all about computers. And it's funny, because there was a certain intelligence agency that was also all about computers at that time. Look up the origins of Silicon Valley. Just a coincidence. But after Timothy Leary got out of jail, after they arrested him in Afghanistan. Did you know that? That's where they abducted him from. That's where he was extradited from. After they grabbed him from Afghanistan, far out, man. Timothy Leary went to federal prison. He got out of federal prison, and he got out, and he was still the drug guru. He was still promoting drugs. Audio versions of my books. I'll write that down. Still promoting drugs. But he would go around to college campuses and different places, and all the drug people, the hallucinogen people would come to see him, and he'd tell them, like, the human mind is a computer, man, and the human brain is like the first computer, and like we got computers that are like not brains anymore, and pretty soon, he was going around promoting tech optimism, right? It was a big thing in the 80s. They talk about the yuppies, and also Jerry Rubin, who was a big, he'd been a yippie. He'd been an activist along with Abby Hoffman. He did the same thing. They both, in the 80s, went around on speaking tours promoting computers and tech optimism. And you can watch a debate. Abby Hoffman remained like an anarchist, left-wing activist. Jerry Rubin became this yuppie, right, who was a tech optimist and liked capitalism and loved computers. There was a debate, yuppie versus yippie. You can watch online, and between Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin, after Jerry Rubin became a yuppie. But Jerry Rubin and Timothy Leary, both of these two hippies, after they, burned out or whatever, they started promoting computers and tech optimism. And it's interesting because there is a lecture was one of the Timothy Leary talks I listened to. He actually did, talk about eventually there's going to be a way that with computers you can make your own TV. And I was just like, I think about that and I go, well, he was kind of right. You know, I guess his CIA handlers, whoever told him that, was onto something. Does it make sense for me to be anti-imperialist on my native island of Tahiti if we don't have enough resources to be independent from France? Aha. Resources. Independent. Very good question. Anti-imperialist. All right. Okay, so there you go. Yeah, I mean, I guess that answers the question about countering hegemonic culture. This is a wild night. All right, why do rad-libs not criticize neoliberalism? Because they have reinvented socialism, specifically to not criticize neoliberalism. I'm sorry, but if you listen to BreadTube, they haven't reinvented socialism to be something that in no way clashes with neoliberalism. It sounds too awful to be true, but I have watched, there have been many debates between the Jacobin synthetic leftists, and Reason Foundation. Reason Foundation are libertarians. They're libertarians who believe, they want to privatize everything. No food stamps, no government assistance, no public schools. They love charter schools. They love prisons for profit. Privatize everything, right? Reason Foundation. Libertarian psychopaths, Ayn Rand, awful human beings. I mean, they're anti-war, I'll give them that. But, they think wars are socialism or something. I mean, it's like, whatever. So the Reason Foundation. Reason Foundation will debate Jacobin. And Reason Foundation, the debate goes exactly like this. Reason Foundation sits there and goes, socialism's never worked anywhere. It's only led to millions of people dying. It's never had a single accomplishment. There's never been any socialist society that has ever accomplished anything. All it leads to is starvation, death, and miserable. And only capitalism can lead to human creativity and blah, 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 blah. And they sit there and they present the message of neoliberalism. Get the government off our backs, privatize everything, right? And then it goes back to Jacobin. And Jacobin goes, that's true. But we're different. We don't like state socialism. No, I mean, I've seen this. They say, oh, that's everything you said is totally true. Yes, communism has never accomplished anything. Yes, the government ruins everything it touches. That's okay. What socialism really means to us is that, we start a pencil factory with all our friends. We just start a pencil factory. It'll be a happy, fun pencil factory. And me and my friend and him, we'll all start a pencil factory and we'll share the profits. It'll be cooperative. That's their response to all the neoliberal lies. And they just say, oh, yeah, well, socialism, it doesn't involve the government. It's a worker cooperative pencil factory. So then it gets back to Reason Foundation. And Reason Foundation says, if you want to start a pencil factory, go ahead. We're not going to stop you. You can start a pencil factory. We are not going to stop you from starting a pencil factory. Go ahead. Libertarians are for that. If you want to start a cooperative pencil factory, the government shouldn't get in your way. Yeah, basically, this bread tube ideology is a way that socialism cannot challenge neoliberalism. That's basically what it is, right? That's all it is, right? Neoliberalism, privatize everything, profits are in command, and they sit there and they agree with it. They've reinvented socialism to be voluntary worker cooperatives, an employee stock ownership program, and the response is success and failure of BPP. The response is, to just, that's really what it is, right? And I have seen anarchists go as far as to defend cuts in government spending because it'll make a revolution happen. Look, if you take all the poor people's welfare away, they'll rise up and revolt quicker. And, I defend charter schools. Hey, schools are indoctrination centers for the empire. We should privatize education. I've seen it. Now, not all of them are that stupid. Most of them are not that stupid. But some of them, this is toxic stuff. It has nothing in common with Marxism, Leninism. It has nothing in common with actual socialism and anti-imperialism. It's a brand of socialism that does not conflict with neoliberalism. Basically, that's what it is, and that's why it's toxic. That's why I can't stand it. That's why I wrote a book about it. That's why I debate these people, and that's why these people hate me. It's because I spit in their face and I say, no, I'm not. No, socialism is about fighting against neoliberalism. It's great. I mean, you could have it's great. I mean, the bread tube model is amazing, right? I mean, you could have a prison industrial complex just so long as all the guards in the prison own a share of the prison, right? Bread tube would love it. Yay! It's a socialist prison, private prison. Right? All the guards are shareholders. And of course, they want to maximize the number of prisoners in there because then they get more profits. And of course, they want to, make the prisoners as miserable as they possible, pay them the worst possible food they could get so they can keep as much of the government money they're getting for locking them all up. But all the guards, it's a cooperative. So, you could have socialist prisons for profit. Belarusian socialism. Socialist prisons for profit. Isn't that amazing? You could have a socialist military-industrial complex. Imagine, right, if all the workers who make the bombs and tanks and guns for Boeing and Raytheon and General Electric all got a share. They would be really enthusiastic next time we want to go to war. When Joe Biden says we got to go invade Iran, right, they'd go, yes, we want our value to increase. We want, all the workers would rally to support the war. I mean, this worker cooperative stuff. Worker cooperatives are great in the context of socialism. And they're good also. I mean, there's nothing wrong with them, but they're not socialism. They are not socialism, Islamic socialism, right? Cooperative capitalism, employee stock ownership programs. I mean, they're not bad necessarily. I mean, they could be bad in some instances, but it's not socialism. And BreadTube exists to make sure that we don't fight the cuts in social spending, to make sure that we don't actually call for a central planned economy. Keep profits in command. They've developed a model of socialism that is compatible with neoliberalism, and it disgusts me. Next, all right, Slavoj Žižek. What about him? I mean, he's a best death of capitalism. Slavoj Žižek is a thinker, an intellectual. He's from former Yugoslavia. I mean, what do you want me to say about him? I mean, I've watched his movie, The Pervert's Guide to Ideology, which is when he dissects movies and has the message. He's got a Freudian psychoanalytical background. He's very anti-China. I vehemently disagree with him about China, but he seems to understand actual Marxism, so I didn't miss that super chat. Islamic socialism, didn't miss that one. Yeah, didn't miss that one. I've got all the super chats, my friend. So there you go. All right. Why did Occupy Wall Street fail? Well, did it fail? I mean, I think it set out what it was intended to do. I mean, Occupy Wall Street never had a stated goal, which was one of its problems from the beginning. So how can it fail if it has no stated goal, right? I mean, I was part of Occupy Wall Street. I wouldn't say it failed. I mean, I think the unstated goal, the actual goal of Occupy Wall Street was that the Democrats were getting kicked around by the Tea Party. The Obama administration couldn't do a lot of what it wanted to do because of the Tea Party. So they had their own Tea Party, which was Occupy Wall Street. And they, all the liberals and all the Democrats, just like the Republicans, all got the memo to go join the Tea Party. Liberals and Democrats got the memo to join Occupy Wall Street. The Republicans had their heat in the street, and so the Democrats had their heat in the street. It was a great place to be. A lot of people, it was the first political thing they ever did. It was a great place to recruit people. I met a lot of people I know became communists because of Occupy Wall Street, and that's good. Yeah, I mean, did it fail? It accomplished what the Democrats wanted it to accomplish. It was still met with brute force. And interestingly, it was Democrats who basically created Occupy Wall Street, who brutally put it down, right? Obama had a big phone call with all these mayors from around the country, and they brutally put down Occupy Wall Street. So put that in your pipe and smoke it. I mean, and that's pretty horrendous. I'm sorry, did I miss a super chat? I see a super chat there, but it's not showing up. It went away. Okay, what was the super chat that just went by? Because it's not showing up in my feed. The last super chat I see is best works on death toll from capitalism. Can someone repeat the super chat that just went by? Because I see it in the top, but I don't see it in the thing. That's very odd. There's been a lot of problems on YouTube. Have you read Fahrenheit 451? All right, Fahrenheit 451. Wrote it down. All right, Fahrenheit 451. All right. But yeah, I mean, I was part of Occupy Wall Street. I wouldn't say it failed. I mean, it accomplished what it was supposed to do. It's pretty wild, that the Democrats set it up, and then, a lot of the people still believed in it, and they didn't stop, so they sent out the police to mace and pepper spray everybody and all of that. So they brutally suppressed it after they themselves created it. But at the same time, I mean, that's really what Occupy Wall Street was. I'm glad I was there. I met a lot of people. I should have gone to the Tea Party and done the same thing. Right? I'm very proud of the fact I went to Occupy Wall Street and pushed an imperialist message and engaged with people and tried to recruit them to communism. But I should have done the same thing at the Tea Party. The Communist Manifesto says that communists support every uprising against the existing order of things, but in all of them, they bring forth the question of property. That's what it doesn't say they just support left-wing ones. No. In all of them, the communists support every uprising against the existing order of things, but in all of them, they bring forth the question of property. That is the guideline. Whenever people are opposed to the system, communists support them and bring forth the question of property. When the working class people were mad about the tax system, and they were saying they were taxed enough already, they were tired of the tax ripoff system, that was an uprising against the existing order of things. So it was our duty to go there, but not tail after their ideology, but confront them about the question of property and say the problem is capitalism. Occupy Wall Street, right? That was a rebellion against the existing order of things, and our job was to support it, but also bring forth the question of property. This is a line from the Communist Manifesto. The job of communists is communists support every uprising against the existing order of things, but in all of them, they bring forth the question of property. And what generally communist groups do in the United States is they do two things. If it's a right-wing uprising against the existing order of things, they don't support it, right? All those workers who assembled on January 6th because they thought Trump was going to stop the wars and they were confused about it. It was an uprising against the existing order of things. No one can approve of what they did and certainly can't approve of their message. But the communists should have supported the people who were in opposition to the system, but challenged them and confronted them on the existing order of things and said, you're wrong in supporting Trump. The answer is communism. Did we do that? No, they're all deplorables. They're all evil monsters. If it's a right-wing uprising, if it's the Tea Party, if it's a right-wing uprising, we don't support it. They're all deplorables. They can all go to hell. However, if it's a left-wing uprising, communists don't bring forth the question of property. They just support it, right? Black Lives Matter. Communists should support it. It's a rebellion against the existing order of things, but it's our job to go there and say, no, the problem isn't white privilege. No, the problem isn't, that we need more, anti-racist trainings in workplaces. The problem is capitalism. The problem is national oppression of black people as a colonized people. We should support Black Lives Matter, but, support it, but we must raise the question of property, right? And the same for Occupy Wall Street. Again, a lot of leftists just supported it, right? Well, no, our duty was to go there and support it and raise the question of property. That's the orientation. Anywhere in our society that you see people that are at odds with the system, anywhere, I don't care where, right? I don't care, anywhere you see people that are at odds with the system. They're vegans and they're angry about factory farms, they're pacifists, they're against the war, they're LGBT activists, they're, anywhere you see people at odds with the system. The job of the communists is to go there and support them, number one, and two, to raise the question of property. Anywhere. I don't care where it is. Now, obviously, you never want to support right-wing ideology. You never want to blatantly support, violence or illegal activity or hate crimes or anything like that. But you want to support the people that are involved in it. Tell them that you sympathize with them. Whenever working people are struggling, are in a revolt against the system, whether from the right, from the left, from the up, from the down, from the backwards, the forwards, I don't care what it is. Whenever people are at odds with the system, whenever people are saying, we are mad at the status quo in America, communists should run to them we should run to them we should run to them as fast as we can and say, we're at odds with the system too. I'm glad you're at odds with the system. Support them. But when we get there, we don't just go, oh, you're right. No, because they're not right. If they're liberals, they're not right. If they're conservatives, they're not right. When we get there, we support them and raise the question of property. This is what Karl Marx said to do. No political test. If working people are at odds with the system, you support every uprising against the existing order of things, but in all of them we bring forth the property question. That is the duty of communists. And I am sick and tired of the two deviations from this. The first deviation being, oh, the workers are right-wing. We don't support them. Why? Right? I'm sorry. I mean, they're wrong. So are liberals. You know, Occupy Wall Street was full of liberals that were pro-imperialist, supported the bombing of Libya. They were wrong. The Tea Party is full of people that were racist and, libertarian and all that. They were wrong. They were wrong, right? Generally, when people are not communists and they are uprising against the system, they are wrong. However, generally, if it's a right-wing group, we just spit on them, they're deplorable. And if it's a left-wing group, we just tail after them. No. Don't tail after the liberals. Don't spit on the conservatives. Whenever people are in revolt against the system, whenever there's an uprising against the existing order of things, communists support it. But in all of them, they bring forth the property question. That's what the Communist Manifesto says. That's your job. That is your job. It's a lot like the Great Commission. Jesus Christ, the first communist in history, told his followers to go and make disciples of all nations. Of all nations. He said, go and make disciples of all nations. Well, Karl Marx's Great Commission. Karl Marx's Great Commission is communists everywhere communists support every uprising against the existing order of things, but in all of them they bring forth the primary question, which is the property question, which is who should control the means of production. That's the property question. Who should control the means of production? That is the Great Commission for communists. Just like Jesus Christ told all of his followers to go and make disciples of all nations, to spread his mission and his teachings all over the world, Karl Marx said that anywhere there's a rebellion against the existing order of things, it is our duty to support it, but bring forth the property question. That's how it works. Okay, I got to write down this super chat that just went by. Okay, decolonization, land back. All right, cool. Folks, I am running out of steam here pretty quick, but that's okay. That's okay. All right. Nietzsche and Carl Jung. Friedrich Nietzsche was a philosopher, Lithuanian-American MMA fighter, insults her Chinese opponent, better dead than red. Thoughts? Was her Chinese opponent a communist? Because if she's not, that's just racism. I don't follow MMA fighting, but I generally don't approve of trash talking of any kind in sports. I think people should be more professional in their sports. So there you go. Yeah, and especially if her opponent's not a communist, then it's just racism. Okay, answered that one. Nietzsche and Carl Jung. Friedrich Nietzsche was a philosopher. I enjoyed his book, Thus Spake Zarathustra. However, ultimately, I consider, Friedrich Nietzsche to not be very good. He hated the Paris Commune. He opposed the Paris Commune. What else about Friedrich Nietzsche? His book, Beyond Good and Evil, is like the basis of a lot of Ayn Rand kind of thinking, basically saying that, kindness and such is for the weak, and that the poor people should all become psychopaths like the rich. I don't like that. Friedrich Nietzsche, Thus Spake Zarathustra is kind of it can be very inspiring to a nonconformist. It can be very inspiring to those who have been, at odds with society and felt kind of stifled. So I like Thus Spake Zarathustra. I do not like Beyond Good and Evil. And overall, I have a negative assessment of Friedrich Nietzsche. Overall, I would have a negative assessment of him. But with the exception, I did enjoy Thus Spake Zarathustra. And there's one particular quote from Friedrich Nietzsche that I like, which is, "One must be filled with chaos to give birth to a dancing star." One must be filled with chaos to give birth to a dancing star. And that is very true. You'll notice that. If you're somebody who have had a lot of hardship in your life, you've had a lot of insecurity in your life, you've struggled and wrangled with the truth, and you've felt conflicted, you are capable of producing something very beautiful, right? People that are unoriginal, people that are just kind of living normal lives at peace with the system, at peace with the world around them. They generally don't produce great advances in history. They don't generally produce great works of art or great scientific breakthroughs. But it's those who are filled with chaos that give birth to a dancing star. That's Friedrich Nietzsche, and it's actually very true. And if you read it, that's what he's referring to, and thus spake Zarathustra. He has this whole concept of the Übermensch, which, again, the Nazis used that in a racial way. He didn't mean it in a racial way. He just means these people that are the vanguard, the people that are, the innovators and the thinkers. He argues the more advanced people, right, are the ones that are always pushing forward the contradiction, challenging the status quo. And he says that, one must be filled with chaos to give birth to a dancing star. And I think he's right about that, right? That generally it's those of us who have had a lot of chaos in our lives, who've had a lot of confusion and insecurity, who've gotten into a lot of conflict with society. We're the ones who produce the dancing star, right? And that's true. You don't want to get into an elitist mindset where you think you're better than everybody else. But, those who create the greatest achievements are often the people who live lives filled with conflict and chaos and insecurity. There's another translation that says, one must have chaos in one's soul to give birth to a shining star. And, that particular quote really speaks to me. I like it. And I think it's true, right? I mean, if you look at, the greatest thinkers and innovators throughout all history, they are people that had chaos within their soul. So there you go. Okay. Sabra and Shatila. I don't know the details of that massacre in enough detail. I know about that horrendous massacre, but I don't have the details in front of me to actually answer that question adequately. So I'm going to table that maybe in another live. All right. Are there audio versions of my book? Well, thank Tristan. Tristan has already recorded an audio version of the City Builders and Vandals essay. It's in many parts on his channel. I'm hoping to edit it all into one and put it on this channel if I can get some time to breathe here pretty soon. Tristan has done a great job of that, reading the opening essay of the We Are City Builders book. That's been excellent. There's others, right? And I've read big, long sections from the Kamala Harris book on my website and stuff, or on YouTube here and stuff. So yes, that's happening. And if somebody wants to record it, I'm not going to sue you. If people want to volunteer on the Discord or whatever, and they want to just read some of my books and put them on YouTube as audiobooks, I won't stop you. It'll be better to have people, reading this stuff. Parasocialite is Tristan's channel. Better to have people engaging with these ideas than it is to, yeah. So there you go. All right. So the person says, well, how can they want Tahiti to break free from imperialism if they don't have enough resources? Well, look, the thing is that first of all, the question of separation is up to the colonized people themselves, right? So if the people of Tahiti don't want to separate, it would be wrong for me to go to them and tell them to. Right? That's up to the people. But on top of that, right, you have the labor power of all the people in Tahiti, right? Do you not? You have the labor power, right? And you could still have a relationship with France or another country that was not a predatory relationship. Being anti-imperialist doesn't mean you become an isolated country that doesn't do business with anybody. Not by any means. It just means that the relationship you have with those countries is not predatory. It's on the basis of win-win cooperation. China trades with countries. It's not imperialist because they're not beating down and wrecking their economy and holding back development. They're doing the opposite, right? And that it's possible Tahiti could develop relationships with countries that were not predatory. All righty. All right. Successes and failures of the Black Panther Party. Almost at the end of my rope here, folks. Whew! That opening took a lot out of me, but it was worth it. All right. The Black Panther Party. The Black Panther Party. It went through some ideological leaps. So it started out as a self-defense organization created by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale in Oakland. It was the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. They had a program, a 10-point program, and it was like an activist self-defense group. It became a Marxist-Leninist vanguard party aimed at the black community. And then there developed to be two currents within it. There was actually a split. There was the Black Panther Party Cleaver and the Black Panther Party Newton. It was East Coast, West Coast. Eldridge Cleaver, who had been a writer, he'd written a book, Soul on Ice, when he was in prison. He got out of prison, he joined the Black Panther Party, and he was an advocate of urban guerrilla warfare and left adventurous terrorism. And Huey Newton, on the other hand, said, oh no, we need survival pending revolution. We need to do the free breakfast program. So there was a split, and the two groups split. Eldridge Cleaver's group, the Black Panther Party Cleaver, was on the East Coast, and they engaged in left adventurous terrorism. A lot of them went to prison. Eldridge Cleaver fled to Cuba and North Korea and eventually France, and then he became a Republican and came back to the United States. Huey Newton, they did the free breakfast program. They did a black community emergency services like an ambulance service. They did a school. They had a school in Oakland, California, and they were around for about another decade, up until the early 80s. The main reason the Black Panthers were crushed was because of the FBI. The COINTELPRO program, they crushed the Black Panthers. And in fact, the FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover, said that the free breakfast program was the greatest threat to the internal security of the United States because so many young black people were going and getting a free breakfast from the Panthers and learning about communism and, being educated about communism while they ate breakfast. And, he thought that was the biggest threat. And it's because of the free breakfast program of the Black Panthers that we actually have the school breakfast program. I bet you didn't know that. We got the school breakfast program. The idea was it would be better that kids, get a breakfast, at school rather than get it from the Black Panthers. And the free breakfast program, that was created by the Black Panthers. That was a success. It was part of the survival pending revolution. Now, it's also important to note that in Chicago, the leader of the Black Panther Party was Fred Hampton. He was murdered by the FBI. He was assassinated in cold blood. It was an assassination. That happened. And there were a number of Black Panthers, Mark Clark and others who were murdered by law enforcement. The best history of the Black Panther Party that I can recommend is We Want Freedom, A Life in the Black Panther Party by Mumia Abu-Jamal. Mumia Abu-Jamal, he's a political prisoner in the United States. He was in the Black Panthers as a teenager, and he wrote a book combining his own experiences with the actual official history of the Black Panthers. And it's a very good book. We Want Freedom, A Life in the Black Panther Party. That's what I recommend. The Black Panthers, they had the theory of intercommunalism, and their goal was to eventually build a multinational communist party. But the idea was that people have to organize their own communities first, right? The Black Panthers were for black people. Young Lords were for the Puerto Ricans. They had the Brown Berets for the Chicano community. They had the Gay Liberation Front for gay people. They had a group called the Young Patriots that was for white people, for, Appalachian whites and low-income whites. And the idea was that all these different groups in the United States would eventually, they would organize their own communities first, and they would set up like a council and merge into one communist party. Never happened, obviously. The Revolutionary Communist Party, the RCP, it was originally a group of mainly white radicals in the Bay Area called the Revolutionary Union, and they were aligned with the Black Panthers, and their idea was that eventually the Black Panthers, they weren't doing it fast enough. So, they got, the Black Workers Congress, which was a group of black auto workers who were Maoists, and they got this Puerto Rican group, and the three of them, they just declared the RCP to be the party the Panthers wanted to build. Most of the Panthers didn't go along with it. So the RCP kind of tried to jump the gun and say they were the party. In 1975, the RCP was formed, but it was not the party the Panthers wanted. Eventually, I think, Huey Newton was charged with murder, and then he fled the United States, and he came back, and he was eventually killed, and it's very, very tragic. The crushing of the Black Panther Party. It was largely it was done because American capitalism was determined to prevent it from happening, and because the white left, largely, black people are a minority in the United States. They are not the majority of the working class here. And among white people, during the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s, there were a lot of white people who were sympathetic to the Black Panthers. That ended in the early 70s. By about, the new communist movement, they called it, which were white people that were sympathetic to the Black Panthers, that were doing what the Black Panthers told them to do, which was trying to build a communist party in working class communities. A lot of them were associated with the Revolutionary Youth Movement too. By the late 70s, early 80s, they had fallen apart, and there wasn't much left of them. They had declined. It had been, there had been a mass group of white people who had supported and been in alliance with the Black Panthers in the early 70s, and by the late 70s, they weren't there anymore. There was also infighting, and there's all kinds of stuff. People say that Elaine Brown, there's many people who believe she was an informant, and she, says she was not an informant, and still to this day, there's, splits about that. I believe there's a lot of people who think that there was an Asian American man who bought them guns, who was a very good friend of the Black Panthers, and that I guess that guy was an FBI informant, and, that they were heavily infiltrated by the government. And there was a lot of different factions among them. They were broken apart. And I think by the early 80s, they had finally dissolved. But, there is the new Black Panther Party, which is different. They're not an explicitly communist grouping. They're more of a black nationalist grouping. There's Muslims, there's, Christians, but it's not a Marxist grouping. And I believe there's a party in Los Angeles called the Black Riders Liberation Party. So yeah, there you go. All right. Belarusian socialism. Well, you should go read The Last Soviet Republic. It's a very good book, and it talks about Belarus and their economic system. So go read The Last Soviet Republic. My voice is running out here, so I can't. Islamic socialism. Well, if by Islamic socialism you're referring to New African Black Panther Party, Dust James, that's an important group to mention as well. Islamic socialism, if you're referring to Gaddafi, that's the Green Book. I've published, the Center for Political Innovation. We have our own edition of the Green Book. So you can read the Green Book by Gaddafi, available on Amazon, and you'll learn all about Islamic socialism. And that's one interpretation. There's a lot of anti-capitalist schools that are Islamic. Baathism is a secular ideology, but it believes Islam is like the greatest aspect of the Arab people. The Islamic Revolution of Iran is neither they reject both socialism and capitalism, but they raise the slogan, not capitalism, but Islam. Gaddafi in Libya, he had a system he called Kibism, which stood for Islamic socialism. So there you go. There's a lot of anti-capitalist thought oriented toward Islam. But the school that calls itself Islamic socialism is generally, it's like Kibism, it's associated with Gaddafi. All right, the best death toll of capitalism. Look, you couldn't add up the death toll of capitalism because it would be, think about everything you would have to add up. Slave trade, colonialism, drug gangs funded in Latin America to fight communists, the body count of the narco gangs in Latin America, all the capitalist wars waged for capitalist profits. All the people who died because they didn't have access to health care, all the people who, just since the famine, just since the pandemic, there have been 9 million people who died of malnutrition. There have been 9 million people died of malnutrition as a result of the pandemic. That's capitalism. That's capitalism. So, the body count for capitalism, they want to give a body count for communism. The body count for capitalism would be so astronomically high. Forget it. Have I read Fahrenheit 451? Yes, it was required reading when I was in school. It's about a society where there's no books and they burn books, and there's a guy, and it's a dystopian novel. I've read it. I don't particularly like the writing style. I found it, a lot less easy to read than 1984. Ray Bradbury's writing style is not my particular one. It's an interesting premise, right? It's about censorship. It's about how books and literary information and the ability to hand out leaflets and is a part of, thought independence. But it's one of those middle-class dystopian rants. I don't really like it, honestly. It's not my favorite book. All right. Decolonization. I have said many times that if colonized people within U.S. borders want to separate and form an independent country, they have the right to do that. But I do not go around advocating that because I am a white man. And if I, as a white man, start going around telling black people or Chicano people or indigenous people that they should separate and have their own country, that sounds very racist, right? It sounds like segregation. So if there is a big movement of black people who want to separate and form an independent black republic, I would support their right to do it. Same for the, Epsilon, the Sun Belt, the Southwest, same for the indigenous groups. And if they separated, they would obviously have to be paid reparations. You couldn't just be like, oh, you're on your own, bye-bye. No, you would have to obviously give them reparations, right? You'd have to make sure that they gained their independence with some resources. So yes, I am for decolonization. I support the right of colonized people within U.S. borders to separate, to have their own territory, and to get reparations from the U.S. government. I think those reparations should be taken from the capitalist corporations that make super profits from exploiting those people. But there you go. So yeah, I mean, I'm for decolonization, but I don't fetishize it. All right, and a lot of the people on the internet who talk about decolonization, they don't really understand what it is. I just explained to you what decolonization is, which is that I would be for the right of any colonized group in the United States to separate if they want it. That's real decolonization. That's the Communist International. That's their position. Okay? There's a lot of these people on the internet who just say, oh, decolonization. Oh, we're Euro settlers. This land was stolen from indigenous people. And what that means is you can't do any activism. You can't try to actively build socialism in America because America's a racist, evil country. That's all it means, right? And if you talk about an actual politics, if you talk about actual program, and you don't just fixate on the USA being racist, which it is, if you don't fixate on that all day long, you're a Euro settler and you're a racist and you're not a real communist, okay? Well, if you want to do that, fine. I can't stop you, but that's not what I'm about, right? I am for the rights of colonized people to separate. I am for reparations, but at the same time, I'm for actually building a multinational working class movement to try and overturn capitalism. I'm not just going to sit around on the internet and wank about how evil America is all day long. I just, and that's what a lot of these very, it's a form of like left doomerism, left pessimism. There's a certain current of people that just want to sit and wank on the internet. America's evil, this is an evil country, nothing good can ever happen, and they just want to sit in this cycle of negativity, and they just want to sit there in their cycle of negativity and be mad. And it's like, that's not going to get you anyplace, right? You need to break out of that kind of thinking. That's depressive thinking, that's hopeless thinking, that's pessimistic thinking, and it's destructive thinking, right? And that's why people become suicidal, and that's why people become alcoholics, and that's why people become drug addicts. And that's why people, that's demoralizing. It's not going to get you anywhere. We need optimism, right? We need to work together, and we need to figure out a way that we can build a socialist movement that can actually achieve socialism in America. And if you just want to sit in this cycle of depression and sit there and talk about how evil America is, I can't stop you, but I'm doing something different. That's not what I'm doing. And of course, they have to lash out at me, right? Just like the incels have to lash out. If you want to make an incel mad, tell them they could actually get a girlfriend. No, I can't. No, I can't. How dare you, right? Because their whole worldview is centered on they can never get a girlfriend, right? So if you want to make a third worldist mad, tell them, we could actually have socialism here. I think it could happen. No, we can't. My whole worldview is centered around that. It can never happen. Oh, okay. Well, there you go, right? It's part of that depression. It's part of that negativity, right? They don't want to actually go and do the work to make it happen. So, if you come along and say, we could actually make it happen, that bursts their bubble. So that's all there is. So that's all there is about that. All right, folks, I'm at the end of my rope. It's been fun. A new upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. The people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. While the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. Old Gringo's got me with a Nixon quote, or a Spiro Agnew quote, the nagging nabobs of negativity. While the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. And on that note, folks, I must say good night.